I have always believed the sea remembers more than the people who cross it. That thought first came to me on a quiet autumn evening, when I stopped beside an old harbor that no longer appeared on most maps. The fishing boats were tied to weathered posts, rocking so gently that they barely disturbed the dark water. A single lighthouse swept its pale beam across the empty docks every few seconds, revealing peeling paint, forgotten nets, and rows of windows that reflected nothing at all. The air carried the sharp scent of salt mixed with old rope that had dried beneath years of sun. Somewhere beyond the breakwater, a bell rang once. Then it never rang again. I stood there much longer than I intended, listening to waves brushing against wood worn smooth by generations of sailors who come home or never had the chance. My grandfather used to tell me that every harbor keeps two histories. One belongs to the living. The other belongs to those who were expected to return but never did. As a child, I laughed whenever he said it. Standing there alone, I found I could no longer remember why. The tide slowly crept higher until the water touched the edge of my boots. That's when I noticed another ship resting far beyond the pier. It carried no lights, no flag, and no sound of an engine. Yet somehow it was moving against the tide, gliding closer with every heartbeat. That was the moment I realized someone was already waiting for me on the dock. I remember the exact place because it was a kind of harbor most people drove past without noticing. It sat on the northern edge of the coast, where the road narrowed between wind-bent grass and quiet water. Late October had already emptied the tourist shops, and only a few weathered signs remained standing beside the old fishing pier. The afternoon sky was pale, almost white, with slow clouds drifting toward the open sea. Small waves tapped against the wooden posts in a steady rhythm that reminded me of someone knocking very softly on an old door. Whenever I smell salt carried on cold air, I think of my father. He spent most of his life repairing fishing boats, and he believed every vessel carried a little of the people who sailed it. When I was young, I would sit beside him while he brushed fresh varnish across cracked rails. The scent stayed on his hands long after the work was finished. He used to smile without looking up. Empty boats always have stories left behind. At the time, I thought he meant old nets, forgotten tools, or faded photographs tucked inside small drawers. Years later, I began to wonder if he meant something else. That afternoon, I had only planned to photograph the abandoned pier before driving farther down the coast. Few people visited anymore. Several planks leaned at strange angles, and faded ropes rested in loose circles where fishermen once hurried through busy mornings. The place felt forgotten, not lonely. There's a difference. Loneliness asks to be noticed. Forgotten places simply continue without expecting anyone to return. I rested my camera on the railing and watched a line of distant gulls disappear into the bright horizon. A cool breeze carried the smell of seawater mixed with old timber that had soaked through countless winters. The familiar scent settled somewhere deep inside my memory, calm enough to make me forget the passing hours. Then I noticed movement beyond the end of the pier. At first, I thought it was another fishing boat returning with the tide, but it moved too quietly. No engine echoed across the water. No wake spread behind it. The boat drifted as though the sea itself had decided where it belonged. It was small, older than anything still used for fishing. Its paint had faded into soft gray patches where blue had once covered the hull. Thin lines of worn would show beneath years of weather. One side carried scratches so deep they almost looked like careful writing. No one stood at the wheel. No one adjusted the ropes. The vessel reached the pier with gentle certainty until its side touched the wooden posts. A single rope slipped across a cleat, as if careful hands had placed it there. Yet no hands appeared. I waited. Perhaps someone was resting below deck. Perhaps they had gone ashore farther along the harbor. The silence stretched comfortably for a while before curiosity finally carried me forward. Each board answered my footsteps with quiet creaks. The boat rocked only once when I stepped aboard. Inside, the cabin was smaller than I expected. A narrow table stood beside the window. Maps rested beneath a smooth glass weight. An old compass lay open beside them. Everything appeared clean, not abandoned. Someone had cared for this place. My eyes settled on a small ceramic cup near the wheel. Steam no longer rose from it, but the coffee inside looked fresh. A faint warmth seemed to linger above the dark surface, though the drink itself had already cooled. I reached toward it before stopping halfway. Something about that simple cup felt more unsettling than an empty cabin ever could. Years might have passed since this boat had last been seen. Yet the coffee looked as though its owner had stepped outside only minutes earlier. I quietly laughed at myself. There had to be a simple answer. Perhaps another fisherman had climbed aboard before me. Perhaps someone enjoyed leaving odd displays for visitors. The explanations sounded reasonable. None of them felt true. I stepped back onto the deck. The harbor remained empty. No voices carried from the shore. No cars passed along the distant road. Only the gentle water brushing against the hull kept me company. I searched every corner of the vessel. A folded blanket rested neatly on one bench. Fishing hooks hung in perfect rows. Even a small pocket watch continued ticking inside an open drawer. Time had not forgotten this boat, only its crew. The daylight slowly faded into evening. I told myself I would leave after one last photograph. Instead, I found myself sitting on the edge of the pier, watching the quiet vessel as darkness settled across the harbor. The lighthouse far away swept one pale beam across the water every few moments. Each pass briefly illuminated the empty deck, then it disappeared again. Hours slipped by. I never saw anyone arrive. I never saw anyone leave. When the cold finally reached my hands, I drove into town and rented a room overlooking the marina. Sleep came lightly. I kept thinking about the untouched coffee, about my father's voice, about stories left behind. Before sunrise, I returned to the harbor. A thin layer of morning light rested over the water, making every surface appear softer than before. The boat remained tied exactly where I had left it. Nothing seemed different until I looked down. Fresh footprints crossed the dam boards of the pier. Bare feet, clear enough to count every toe. They began beside the cabin door. They walked calmly to the very end of the dock. There they continued without hesitation, straight into the sea. I followed them as far as I could. The final print filled slowly with seawater. Then another wave arrived. When it pulled away, the footprints were gone. Behind me, somewhere aboard the empty boat, I heard a chair slide gently across the cabin floor. I remember that evening because the rain began before the sun had completely disappeared. It wasn't a heavy storm, just a steady curtain of water that softened the shoreline and turned the harbor into a place made of gray light and quiet reflections. The old lighthouse stood alone at the end of a narrow stone path, its white paint faded by decades of salt wind. I had seen it from my hotel window that morning, and after what happened with the empty fishing boat, I could not stop thinking about it. The keeper's house had long since been abandoned. The windows were cloudy. The front gate leaned slightly to one side. Even so, the path was clear, as though someone walked it off enough to keep the weeds from taking over. I pulled my coat tighter and climbed the worn steps. The wooden door opened with only a gentle push. Inside, the air felt dry compared to the rain outside. It carried the soft scent of melted candle wax mixed with dusty books that had rested untouched for many years. Water dripped quietly from the edge of my sleeve onto the old floorboards. The room looked almost welcoming. Shelves lined one wall, filled with journals whose leather covers had faded into shades of brown and gray. A small desk faced a window. Beside it stood a chair with a folded blanket draped neatly across the back. It reminded me of my grandfather's study. He never liked throwing books away. He believed every page remembered the hands that had turned it. I smiled at the thought. For a little while, the lighthouse no longer felt unsettling, only forgotten. The spiral staircase curved upward through the center of the tower. Above me, I could hear the slow turning of the great lantern. That stopped me. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years. There should have been no light. Yet every few moments a pale beam swept across the windows, gliding through the room before slipping back into the rain. I looked upward. The mechanism turned with quiet certainty. Slow, steady, as though someone high above had never stopped tending it. Curiosity carried me to the first landing. The steps complained softly beneath my weight, but the tower answered with nothing else. No voices, no movement, only the distant sound of rain brushing against the glass outside. When I reached the next landing, another sweep of light crossed the narrow window. A figure stood inside the lantern room. just for a heartbeat. Tall, facing the sea, one hand resting near the glass. I hurried upward. My breathing became louder than the turning light. Another flight, another landing. By the time I reached the lantern room, it was empty. The lamp continued its slow circle. Its polished lens reflected only rain and darkness beyond the windows. No footprints marked the dusty floor. No coat hung from hooks beside the door. I walked around the circular room twice. Nothing. I laughed under my breath, trying to settle the growing unease. The light had distorted something outside. That was all. The rain, the moving glass, a tired imagination after yesterday's strange discovery. I rested my hand against the cool railing and watched the harbor below. The empty fishing boat was gone. Only the weathered pier remained. For reasons I could not explain, that troubled me more than the figure. The beam completed another slow turn. As it passed over the sea, I caught another glimpse of someone standing below, not in the lantern room. Outside, near the edge of the path leading to the lighthouse. A different person this time. Shorter, wearing what looked like a dark raincoat. I leaned closer to the window. The next sweep of light revealed only wet stones and quiet water. I hurried downstairs. The front door still stood open where I had left it. Rain tapped gently against the steps. No one waited outside. The path stretched back toward town, without a single person walking it. Even the puddles were untouched. I told myself I should leave. Instead, I wandered through the lower rooms once more. In a small reading room beside the entrance, I found a visitor's book resting beneath a layer of dust. The last written name was dated almost 30 years earlier. Underneath it, someone had written only 5 words. Keep watching the lantern turn. Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. The letters looked surprisingly fresh. I closed the book. The sound echoed farther than it should have. As evening deepened, the rain slowly began to fade. I decided one final climb would quiet my mind before I returned to town. The staircase seemed longer this time. Halfway up, the light swept across a narrow window. Someone stood in the lantern room again. An elderly woman. She gazed directly toward the stairs. Before I could reach the top, another turn of the light carried brightness across the walls. When I entered the room, she was gone. Only the lamp remained, turning without pause. I stood there until the clouds began to thin. The harbor below grew brighter with the first hint of dawn. One final sweep crossed the sea. The beam reached the horizon and stopped, not for a second, not for 2. It remained fixed on one place far beyond the harbor, as though it found something waiting in the darkness. I followed its path into the distance. Whatever held the light's attention never revealed itself. The lantern began turning again, but before it moved, I heard a quiet voice somewhere behind me. It whispered only one word. Closer. I reached the harbor cafe a few minutes before midnight, because I could not bring myself to return to my room. The whisper inside the lighthouse had stayed with me all day, not because it was loud, because it sounded familiar, like hearing the voice of someone you have not seen in years, only to realize you cannot remember their face. The rain had passed by then, leaving the streets damp beneath the pale glow of old lamps. Reflections shimmered across the pavement as I followed the waterfront. Most of the buildings had gone dark hours earlier, their windows black against the quiet harbor. Only one place remained open, a small cafe tucked between an old bait shop and a boarded-up chandlery. Its sign creaked gently in the night breeze. A single yellow light glowed behind the window. As I stepped inside, warmth settled around me. The rich scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the gentle aroma of black tea. Somewhere near the back, a small clock ticked softly. The room was modest. 6 wooden tables. A long counter polished smooth by countless hands. Photographs of fishing crews covered one wall, each frame faded by time until the smiling faces seemed almost part of the wood itself. There were customers, 5 of them. Each sat alone. No one spoke. They simply held steaming cups while droplets of rain slid slowly from their coats onto the floor. I nodded politely. No one returned the gesture. The woman behind the counter smiled with quiet kindness. Without asking what I wanted, she poured a cup of black tea and placed a slice of warm bread beside it. The steam rose slowly between us. "You look tired," she said. It was the first voice I had heard since entering. "I suppose I am." She gave a small nod. "The harbor keeps people awake." That was all. She walked away before I could ask another question. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. The heat reminded me of winter evenings from childhood. My mother always insisted tea tasted better when the windows rattled in the wind. I never believed her then. Now I wasn't so sure. Outside, the harbor looked peaceful. The lighthouse beams swept across the water every few moments. Each passed brightened the cafe for an instant before fading again. I noticed something odd. Every customer had removed a dripping raincoat. Each coat hung neatly beside its chair. Yet none of them touched the bread placed before them. None lifted a cup. None even looked toward the window. They simply sat, waiting. I tried reading the old photographs instead. One caught my attention. A fishing crew stood proudly beside a weathered boat. The vessel looked strangely familiar. It was the same one that had drifted into the abandoned pier the day before. Before I could study the picture more closely, the owner returned carrying another cup of tea. She placed it carefully on the empty chair beside the window. No one occupied that table. She adjusted the cup slightly, as though making room for an unseen guest. Then she quietly returned behind the counter. No explanation, no glance in my direction. The extra cup remained untouched. Minutes passed. The bread on every table cooled. The tea no longer steamed. Still no one moved. The silence became so complete that I could hear the faint scratch of tree branches brushing the roof outside. It felt less like a cafe, more like a room holding its breath. Unable to ignore my curiosity, I walked toward the window. The harbor beyond looked exactly as I expected. Dark water, empty docks, the familiar outline of the lighthouse. I rested one hand against the cool glass. A fishing buoy drifted slowly with the tide. Nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed my reflection. It stood a heartbeat behind me, not matching my movement. I turned immediately. The cafe looked perfectly ordinary. 5 customers remained seated. The owner wiped the counter with slow, practiced motions. My chair stood exactly where I had left it. I looked back toward the window. Only my own reflection stared back now. I laughed softly under my breath. Lack of sleep. Too many strange places. That had to be all. I returned to my table. The tea had gone cold. Across the room, the owner carried a fresh loaf from the kitchen. The comforting smell filled every corner once again. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then the old clock struck midnight. One gentle chime. Then another. By the 12th, every customer rose at exactly the same moment. Their chairs slid quietly across the wooden floor. Each person put on their raincoat. No one spoke. No one looked at me. They walked toward the front door one after another. The owner watched them leave with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. When the last customer stepped outside, she turned toward me. "You should finish your tea." "I don't think I can." She smiled sadly. They never do either. Before I could ask what she meant, I heard the harbor bell ring in the distance. Just once. Its deep note lingered over the water. Drawn by instinct, I stepped outside. The street was empty. No footsteps echoed along the pavement. No figures disappeared into the darkness. The customers had vanished as though they had never been there. I looked back through the cafe window. Every chair was neatly tucked beneath its table. The extra cup beside the window was gone. Only the owner remained. She stood behind the counter, watching me. When our eyes met, she slowly reached for another teacup. She placed it on the empty table by the window. Then she looked toward the door, as if she were expecting someone else to arrive. The morning the tide disappeared began like any other along the harbor. The sky held a pale silver color that made the sea look almost endless. A cool breeze drifted across the shoreline, carrying the faint taste of seaweed and clean minerals. Fishing ropes swayed lazily against old wooden posts, and somewhere far out on the water, a lone gull circled before fading into the bright horizon. I had slept very little. The empty boat, the lighthouse, the cafe that welcomed people who seemed to vanish with midnight. Each memory rested quietly in my thoughts, never demanding attention, yet never allowing me to forget. When I reached the waterfront, A small crowd had already gathered near the end of the harbor. No one sounded frightened, only confused. The sea had retreated farther than anyone could remember, not a few extra yards. Hundreds. The water had pulled away until the harbor floor lay exposed beneath the morning light. Dark sand stretched toward the distant waves, broken by forgotten anchors, splintered crates, and pieces of old fishing nets that must have rested there for decades. Children pointed excitedly. Older fishermen stood in silence. One elderly man removed his cap and whispered something I could not hear. My father once told me that the ocean never truly gives anything back. If you find something the tide has hidden, he used to say, ask yourself why it chose today. I found myself remembering those words as I stepped carefully across the damp sand. The ground felt firm beneath my boots. Tiny shells glimmered like scattered stars. Every step uncovered another piece of the harbor's past. A rusted chain, a cracked lantern, the broken frame of a wooden wheel. None of it seemed remarkable until I saw the bell. It rested half buried near a cluster of ancient anchors, its bronze surface darkened by time. Green traces of age covered its sides, yet the metal looked strangely whole, untouched by the years that should have worn it away. There was no tower nearby, no rope attached. It simply waited beneath the open sky. Several people noticed it, yet none walked closer. Without speaking, they slowly drifted back toward the pier as though they had already seen enough. Soon I was alone. The breeze softened. Even the distant waves seemed quieter. I knelt beside the bell and brushed away a thin layer of damp sand. The bronze felt colder than I expected. Not painfully cold, just different, like touching something that had never warmed beneath the sun. A weathered inscription circled its rim. Most of the letters had faded beyond reading. Only a few remained clear. For those who returned, the rest had disappeared. I reached toward the bell. My fingers barely grazed its surface. It rang. The sound was gentle, far softer than a church bell. Its single note drifted across the empty harbor and dissolved into the open air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a memory entered my mind. Not one of my own. I was standing on the deck of a sailing ship beneath a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. The wooden rail felt rough beneath my hands. Someone beside me laughed. I turned to answer. The face waiting there belonged to a man I had never met, yet I knew his name before he spoke. Thomas. The memory vanished as quietly as it had arrived. I was kneeling beside the bell once again. My heart beat a little faster. The harbor remained silent. I stood slowly, telling myself exhaustion could explain strange thoughts. Still, curiosity lingered. I touched the bell a second time. Another clear note floated outward. This time I stood inside a tiny cottage overlooking the sea. A young girl carefully folded a letter while humming a tune I somehow recognized. She smiled toward the doorway. Father will be home before winter. The words carried such certainty that they ached. Then the room dissolved. I was back beside the bell. The breeze carried only the clean scent of the distant ocean. I stepped away. My hands trembled slightly. Those memories had felt complete, not like dreams, not like imagination. They carried details no dream would bother inventing. The pattern stitched into the girl's sleeve, the worn edge of the letter, the faint warmth of a fire somewhere behind me. None of them belonged to my life. Behind me, I heard quiet footsteps. The elderly fisherman from earlier stood several yards away. He watched the bell without looking at me. "You heard it," he said. I nodded. He looked toward the sea. "It remembers." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked back toward town. I never saw where he went. The clouds thickened overhead. A distant swell rolled toward the harbor. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the tide was returning. Water spread across the sand in thin silver ribbons, filling old footprints and circling forgotten anchors before rising higher with each passing minute. I backed toward the pier. The bell remained exactly where it had rested. One small wave reached its base. Another followed. Within moments, the bronze disappeared beneath the water, as though it had never been there. People gathered again along the harbor wall. Some pointed toward the rising tide. Others simply watched. No one mentioned the bell. No one asked where it had gone. It was as if they had forgotten seeing it at all. I wanted to ask someone. Instead, I remained quiet. The water continued climbing until the harbor looked perfectly ordinary once more. Fishing boats rocked gently in their places. The exposed sand vanished beneath calm waves. Nothing remained to prove the morning had been unusual. Nothing except the sound. Long after the tide had covered the bell, I continued hearing its single note, not in the harbor, not through the air, somewhere deep inside my memory, as though it had found a place that water could never reach. The house stood where the breakwater met the open sea. I noticed it late on a Thursday afternoon, while walking beyond the last row of fishing sheds. The sky had turned the soft color of fading pearl, and long waves rolled against the rocks with a slow, steady rhythm. Wind moved through the tall beach grass, carrying the dry scent of old cloth airing in the sun, followed by the gentle fragrance of lavender that seemed strangely out of place so close to the shore. The cottage was small, white paint peeled from the walls in narrow strips. Its garden had long surrendered to wildflowers and climbing vines. Only one thing suggested someone still lived there. Smoke rose quietly from the chimney. I had meant to continue along the coast. Instead, I found myself stopping at the weathered gate. Before I could knock, the front door opened. An elderly woman smiled as though she had been expecting me. "You've come a long way," she said softly. There was no surprise in her voice, only kindness. I smiled back. "I suppose I have. Come inside. The evening grows cold." The warmth of the house settled around me the moment I crossed the threshold. Every room carried the comforting scent of lavender tucked into old drawers, mixed with the clean smell of well-worn blankets that had been cared for over many years. A small fire glowed inside the stone fireplace, and its light rested gently across polished furniture that looked older than the harbor itself. Nothing felt abandoned. Everything had its place. Family photographs covered the mantel. A brass clock marked the passing minutes with quiet certainty. Beside the window stood a wooden chair facing the sea. Its cushion showed the faint shape of someone who seemed to have only just stood up. "I don't often have visitors," the woman said. She motioned toward the table. "But Thursdays are different." I thanked her and sat. The chair was warm, as though another guest had been there only moments before. She poured tea into 2 delicate cups. Then she placed 2 plates on the table. Fresh bread, butter, a bowl of warm stew, whose rich aroma filled the room. I looked from one place setting to the other. "You have company coming?" "My husband," she answered without hesitation. "He always comes home on Thursdays." Something in the way she spoke kept me from asking the obvious question. Instead, I watched her smooth the edge of the tablecloth with gentle hands. "My father repaired boats," I said after a while. "He believed sailors always found their way home." She smiled. "A wise man." For a few minutes we spoke of ordinary things. The changing seasons, the lighthouse, the quiet winters when storms kept everyone indoors. It felt pleasant, almost peaceful. Outside, waves rolled against the breakwater with patient rhythm, while the last light of afternoon slowly disappeared beyond the sea. Then she glanced toward the clock. "He'll be here soon." Her face brightened. She stood and carefully straightened the empty chair across from her. She adjusted the spoon beside the untouched bowl. Then she folded a napkin once more, although it had already been perfectly arranged. Small habits, the kind shared by people who have spent many years caring for someone they love. The front room fell quiet. We waited. The fire settled into glowing embers. Somewhere upstairs, Old would answer the changing temperature with a gentle creak. Minutes passed. The second bowl of stew cooled untouched. I found myself looking toward the front door every few moments without realizing it. She noticed. He never hurries. Her smile never faded. He likes the sound of waves. The evening deepened. The windows became dark mirrors. Only the firelight and the brass clock remained bright inside the cottage. I wondered how many Thursdays had passed exactly like this one. How many meals had been prepared. How many quiet evenings had ended with Hope sitting patiently beside an empty chair. At last I gathered the courage to ask, "How long has your husband been at sea?" She looked toward the window. 43 years. The words settled gently between us. Not dramatic, not bitter, simply true. The ship never returned. I lowered my eyes. I'm sorry. She shook her head. No. After a long pause, she whispered, they simply never found it. Neither of us spoke again. The silence did not feel uncomfortable, only full, the kind that grows inside houses where memories have become faithful companions. Outside, darkness covered the shoreline. The lighthouse beam swept briefly across the windows before moving on toward the sea. The clock reached another hour. Its quiet chime echoed through the room. Then came another sound, a soft scrape, near the front porch. The woman looked up immediately. Her smile returned. I told you. Neither of us moved. Another scrape, closer this time. Heavy, measured, as though someone had crossed the damp ground, wearing thick boots. The footsteps reached the front door. Stopped. The old handle never turned. No knock followed, only silence. The woman stood slowly. She walked to the entrance with calm certainty and rested one hand against the door. Good evening, she whispered. She waited. Then, just as gently, she returned to her chair. He doesn't like coming inside anymore. There was no sadness in her voice, only understanding. Hours seemed to pass before I finally rose to leave. She thanked me for sharing dinner. At the doorway, she pressed a small sprig of dried lavender into my hand. For the road. The night air felt colder than before. I walked only a few steps before something urged me to look back. The cottage windows glowed warmly behind me. The table was still set for two. The elderly woman remained seated beside the fire, waiting. As the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, I noticed something beside the front door, a pair of muddy sea boots. They had not been there when I arrived. Water slowly dripped from their worn leather onto the wooden porch. I did not walk back to the house. I stood perfectly still until the lighthouse beam swept across the shoreline. When the light reached the porch, the boots were gone. Only the closed front door remained, as quiet as the sea beyond it. The children were the first to mention the little ship. I heard them talking while I sat on a weathered bench overlooking the harbor one cool afternoon in early November. Their voices drifted between bursts of laughter, carried by a breeze that barely disturbed the calm water. Above them, white clouds moved lazily across a pale blue sky, while fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings. Most adults ignored them. Children often invent stories near the sea. The harbor had taught me that some stories deserve more attention than others. One boy pointed toward the horizon. It comes when the water looks like glass. Another nodded quickly, and it never gets close. A little girl hugged an old knitted scarf around her shoulders. My grandmother says not to wave. The others became unusually quiet. When they noticed me watching, they hurried away without another word. I remained on the bench for a long time. The conversation should have slipped from my mind. Instead, it stayed there, ever since I'd arrived at the harbor. Every strange tale had led me somewhere I never expected. The empty boat, the lighthouse, the cafe that welcomed silent guests, the bell beneath the retreating tide, the lonely cottage where hope refused to grow old. Perhaps this would become another memory, or perhaps it would become another question. The sea decided before I did. Late that evening, the wind faded until the harbor rested beneath perfect calm. The water became so smooth that it reflected the fading sky like polished glass. Even the smallest ripples disappeared. That was when I saw it, far beyond the breakwater. A tiny ship drifted across the quiet sea. It was much smaller than a fishing boat, almost delicate. Its hull shone pale beneath the last light of day, while its sails caught the evening breeze in a way that seemed impossible. They were not made of canvas. Even from that distance, I could tell the sails looked like folded sheets of paper, dozens of them, each one carefully creased, rising and falling with graceful movements that resembled pages turning inside an invisible book. I walked farther along the pier. The vessel remained distant. No matter how far I went, it never seemed any closer. A gentle breeze reached the shore. It carried an unexpected fragrance. Not salt, not rain. The faint scent of dried flowers floated through the cool evening air, delicate enough to remind me of the pressed blossoms my mother kept inside the pages of her favorite novels. Whenever she opened one, the room filled with the quiet memory of spring, even during the coldest winters. I had not thought about those books in years. The memory arrived as naturally as breathing. The ship continued gliding across the still water. Without warning, something white lifted from its deck. Then another, then several more. At first I mistook them for seabirds. As they drifted closer, I realized they were envelopes. Dozens of them floated through the air without falling, moving gently until they reached the harbor. One settled on the pier a few feet away. Another landed beside an old anchor. A third rested near my shoes. The paper felt dry despite the sea. Its edges were perfectly folded. No stamp, no address, only a single name written in careful handwriting. Elias Turner. I did not know anyone by that name. Nearby, another envelope rested against a wooden post. Margaret Ellis. Another, Thomas Reed. The names continued, one after another. Each belonged to someone I had never met, yet each carried the quiet weight of belonging to a real person. I remembered the inscription on the bronze bell. For those who return. A cool feeling settled over me. The harbor had begun weaving its stories together. I bent down and picked up one envelope. It was lighter than I expected. Inside rested a single sheet of paper. Blank, not a word. Only the faint scent of dried flowers remained. The breeze strengthened for just a moment. More envelopes drifted across the pier like slow-moving leaves before settling into quiet rows. Then I noticed one lying by itself, closer than the others. My name was written across the front. Not printed, written. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to me. The same careful slant I used when writing postcards. For several seconds, I simply stared. A strange thought crossed my mind. Perhaps I had written it long ago and forgotten. The idea lasted only a moment. The paper looked untouched by time. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was another folded page. Unlike the others, this one held a message. Only one sentence. You've been following our wake since before you arrived. No signature. No date. Nothing else. I read it again. The words did not change. Behind me, the harbor remained silent. When I looked back toward the sea, the little ship had already turned. Its paper sails caught a breeze I could not feel. Slowly, gracefully, it drifted toward the fading horizon. The envelopes resting across the pier began to stir. One by one, they lifted from the wooden boards. No gust carried them. They simply rose. They floated back across the calm water, returning to the distant vessel until the last white shape disappeared into the evening light. Only my envelope remained. I looked down at the message once more. The ink had begun to fade, letter by letter, until the page became completely blank. The fragrance of dried flowers lingered for a few moments longer. Then it too was gone. I folded the empty paper and slipped it into my coat pocket. For reasons I could not explain, I could not bring myself to throw it away. As darkness settled over the harbor, I started to walk back toward town. Halfway there, I reached into my pocket to touch the envelope again. It was no longer there. The pocket was empty. Ahead of me, a child stood at the end of the street, looking toward the sea. Without turning around, he spoke softly. Next time, he paused, as though listening to someone I could not hear. Read it before it forgets you. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of faded slate. A light breeze moved across the harbor, carrying the sharp scent of motor oil from the working docks. It mixed with the rich smell of aging leather that drifted from old workshops lining the waterfront. Fishermen had already begun repairing nets, speaking quietly as they prepared for another ordinary day. I envied them. Their morning seemed untouched by the strange things that had quietly become part of mine. After finding the empty envelope in my missing pocket, or rather, not finding it at all, I decided I needed answers instead of more questions. The oldest building in the harbor seemed the right place to begin. The harbor master's office sat beyond the main docks, leaning slightly toward the sea after decades of winter storms. Moss covered parts of its stone foundation, while faded blue paint clung stubbornly to the wooden walls. The front door was unlocked. It opened with a slow sigh. Dust floated through narrow beams of morning light, turning the quiet room almost golden. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crowded with thick ledgers whose spines had cracked with age. Brass hooks lined one wall, each holding keys that no longer carried labels. Everything smelled of old work. Oil, leather, paper, time. A large desk stood beneath the window. Someone had left an ink bottle beside an open ledger. The ink had long since dried. At least, that was what I expected. I stepped closer. The pages were covered with neat handwriting. Every line recorded the arrival and departure of ships that had visited the harbor over many generations. Dates, captains, crew members, cargo, every journey carefully preserved. My grandfather kept journals much the same way. He believed that writing things down protected them from being forgotten. Looking across those shelves, I wondered how many lives had been saved from disappearing simply because someone had taken the time to write their names. I turned another page, then another. The entries continued without interruption, until they didn't. Halfway through one ledger, I stopped. A list of 12 crew members filled the left page. I blinked. There were only 11. I frowned and looked again. I was certain there had been 12 names. Perhaps I had counted too quickly. I read the list once more. 11. Satisfied with my mistake, I turned the page. A faint scratching sound reached my ears. I looked around. Nothing moved. The office remained perfectly quiet. Outside, distant gulls called over water. Inside, the sound came again. Soft, steady, like the careful movement of a pen across paper. It seemed to come from somewhere behind the desk. I walked around it. Nothing. Only another stack of ledgers waiting to be opened. I chose the thickest one and carefully lifted its cover. The pages near the beginning listed ships that had sailed nearly 200 years earlier. Every entry appeared complete, until I reached one particular voyage. The captain's name remained. The ship's name remained. But beneath them, the entire crew had vanished. Blank lines stretched across the page where names should have been. I stared in confusion. The faint scratching returned. This time it sounded closer. I spun toward the doorway. No one stood there. The keys hanging on the wall remained perfectly still. I looked back at the ledger. Letters were disappearing. Not quickly, not dramatically. One by one. A surname faded first. Then another. Ink dissolved into the yellow paper until only empty lines remained. I felt my breath catch. The office seemed smaller than before. I reached for another ledger. Perhaps this one would make sense. It did not. More pages. More missing names. Whole crews erased as though they had never existed. Only the ships remained. Empty vessels sailing through history alone. I remembered the boat that had drifted into the forgotten pier. No crew. Fresh coffee. No answers. A cold realization settled over me. Perhaps the harbor had been forgetting people for a very long time. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier. I noticed another ledger lying open on the desk. Unlike the others, its pages looked almost new. The date written across the top matched today's. No entries filled the page. Only neat lines waiting to be written. At the bottom rested a single blank space beneath the printed word. Crew. My fingers hovered above the paper. Without thinking, I reached toward the pen lying beside the bottle of ink. It felt warm, as though someone had been using it only moments earlier. I picked it up. The nib glistened with fresh black ink. A drop gathered slowly at its tip. Before it could fall, the pen moved. Not by much, only enough for me to feel it. A gentle pull, downward, toward the empty page. I released it at once. The pen settled quietly beside the ledger. Nothing happened. I took one careful step backward. The scratching began again. This time the sound came from the page itself. Before my eyes, dark ink appeared across the paper. No hand guided it. No pen touched the surface. Letters formed with slow, careful strokes. One word at a time. Arrived, another pause, then another word. Waiting, the ink lingered. One final line began to form. I watched the first letter appear. Then the second, an M, an A. I couldn't make myself read the rest. Every instinct told me to leave. I closed the ledger without another glance. The sharp sound echoed through the empty office. I hurried toward the door, my footsteps louder than they should have been. Outside, sunlight covered the harbor as though nothing unusual had happened. Boats drifted peacefully. Children chased one another along the docks. Life continued. I turned once more toward the office window. From where I stood, I could see the open ledger resting on the desk. Its pages were still. Its pen lay exactly where I had left it. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. Then the pen lifted by itself, just enough to touch the paper. From inside the empty office came the slow, unmistakable sound of someone writing my name. It happened on an evening when the sea forgot how to move. I reached the harbor just before sunset, expecting the familiar rhythm of waves striking the docks. Instead, I found complete stillness. The water stretched from the shore to horizon like a sheet of polished glass, reflecting the fading skies so perfectly that it became difficult to tell where the sea ended and the heavens began. Even the fishing boats seemed uncertain. Their ropes hung loose without the usual pull of the tide. Not one gull circled overhead. Not one fish disturbed the surface. The entire harbor felt as though it had paused between one breath and the next. I stood at the end of the main wharf for several minutes, listening. There was almost nothing to hear, only the distant creak of an old mast somewhere behind me, and the quiet rustling of my coat whenever the faint evening breeze found it. The silence was not peaceful. It felt unfamiliar, as if the sea itself were waiting for something. I remembered something my father once told me after a storm had passed. The ocean makes noise so people won't notice how much it knows. I laughed when he said it. Standing there that evening, I wished I had asked him what he meant. The wooden planks beneath my boots felt strangely warm. The day had been cool from morning until dusk, yet the timber held the comforting heat of afternoon sunlight. I knelt and rested my hand against the boards. The warmth lingered, not natural, not frightening, simply impossible. A fisherman passed farther down the pier, carrying an empty bucket. He looked at the water only once. Then he quietly turned around and walked back toward town, without casting a single line. His calm retreat unsettled me more than panic would have. If those who knew the harbor best were leaving, perhaps they understood something I did not. The sun slipped lower. Gold became orange. Orange softened into gray. The reflection remained perfect. No ripple disturbed it. I took another slow step toward the end of the wharf. Then another. Halfway there, I heard my name, very softly. It drifted upward rather than across the air. I looked behind me. The pier was empty. The voice came again. Not louder. Closer. I leaned over the railing. The water beneath me reflected the sky with impossible clarity. For a long moment, I saw only clouds. Then another face appeared beside my reflection. Mine, only younger, perhaps 10 years old. His eyes looked upward, meeting mine through the unmoving surface. He smiled, the same shy smile my mother always photographed on the first day of school. I stepped back so quickly the railing brushed against my coat. The reflection disappeared. The water became ordinary once more. I closed my eyes for a moment. Too many sleepless nights. Too many unanswered questions. That had to be the reason. When I opened them again, the sea remained perfectly still. Then the voices began. At first they were too faint to understand. A murmur. Several voices layered together beneath the water. Not angry. Not pleading. Simply talking. The sound reminded me of people speaking quietly in another room. I moved closer again despite every sensible thought telling me not to. The words slowly became clearer. You dropped your shell? I frowned. That sentence meant nothing. Another voice followed. Don't run so close to the rocks. My breath caught. Only one person had ever said those words to me. My mother. I had been 7 years old. She called after me while I chased waves along a beach hundreds of miles from this harbor. No one else had been there. No one else could have remembered. More voices rose from below. Some belonged to strangers. Others belonged to people I loved. My grandfather laughing while teaching me to tie fishing knots. My father humming quietly as he repaired broken railings. Even my own voice drifted upward, repeating words from childhood that I had completely forgotten. Each memory arrived untouched, perfect, as though the sea had been listening all along. I pressed both hands against the railing. The wood remained warm beneath my fingers. The voices continued, not asking me to jump, not calling me closer, only remembering. Every joyful afternoon, every forgotten conversation, every quiet goodbye, tears gathered before I realized I was crying, not from fear, from recognition. So much of life disappears without anyone noticing. Yet somehow the harbor had kept every small piece safe. The whispers slowly faded, one by one, until only silence remained again. I looked across the glass like water, far out near the horizon. Something disturbed the reflection. A single circle spread gently across the surface. Then another. No fish appeared. No boat crossed the distance. Only widening rings that reached the shore without making a sound. The warmth beneath my hands vanished. The planks became cool once more. Behind me, the harbor returned to life. A gull cried overhead. Ropes tapped softly against wooden posts. Somewhere a bell rang the hour. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The impossible calm had ended. I turned to leave. After only a few steps, I glanced back toward the water one last time. The surface reflected the evening sky exactly as before. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, deep beneath the clear reflection, I saw dozens of faces looking upward. They did not move. They did not wave. They simply watched until a passing breeze scattered the image into ordinary ripples. I lowered my eyes. This time, I chose not to look again. The lantern was waiting for me before I ever noticed it. Several quiet days had passed since the sea had fallen silent. I spent those mornings wandering the harbor with no destination in mind, hoping the ordinary rhythm of fishing boats and shopkeepers would settle the growing weight in my thoughts. The strange moments never truly left me. They simply rested somewhere behind my eyes, returning whenever the wind carried the smell of salt across the docks. That evening, the sky darkened earlier than usual. Heavy clouds covered the last traces of sunlight, leaving the harbor wrapped in a cool blue twilight. A gentle breeze moved across the empty pier, carrying the familiar scent of burning wood from a chimney somewhere farther inland. The fragrance reminded me of winter nights when my father and I would sit beside the stove after long days repairing boats, saying very little because the quiet itself felt enough. I found comfort in that memory. It almost made me turn back. Instead, I kept walking. The oldest pier stretched farther into the harbor than the others. Few people use it anymore. Many of its posts leaned with age, and several boards had been replaced by newer timber that never quite matched the original wood. That was where I saw it. A single lantern hung from a weathered iron hook at the very end of the dock. I was certain it had not been there before. Its frame was made of dark brass polished smooth by countless hands. The glass looked perfectly clean despite the years the pier had endured. Inside, a blue flame burned with quiet steadiness. No smoke, no flicker, just a calm blue light. I walked closer. The lantern gave off almost no warmth. It should have felt cold. Instead, it seemed untouched by temperature altogether. I leaned near enough to study the flame. It moved gently inside the glass without consuming a wick or fuel. My grandfather once collected old lanterns from retired ships. As a child, I loved opening them to see how they worked. He always laughed and reminded me that every light needed something to feed it. This one did not. I reached toward the handle. Before my fingers touched the metal, the blue flame grew slightly brighter. Not enough to hurt my eyes, just enough to let me know it had noticed. I pulled my hand away. The brightness faded immediately. A quiet unease settled over me. The harbor behind me remained almost empty. Only a few distant windows glowed along the shoreline. No one else seemed aware of the lantern. I stood beside it until darkness fully covered the sea. Finally, I turned and walked back to town. The next evening I returned. The lantern remained exactly where I had found it. Nothing had changed, or so I believed. Halfway down the pier, I stopped. Another lantern now hung beside the first. It matched perfectly. Same polished brass, same clear glass, same blue flame burning without fuel. The two lights swayed gently even though the air was completely calm. I counted the iron hooks. There had always been room for two. I simply told myself I had overlooked the second one. That explanation stayed with me until the third night. 3 lanterns, then 4, then 5. Each evening another appeared. No one carried them there. No footsteps marked the pier. No boats approached after sunset. The harbor accepted each new light without question. Only I seemed to notice that their number was growing. By the sixth evening, I stopped asking whether I should return. I knew I would. Curiosity has a quiet voice. Sometimes it is impossible to ignore. The row of blue flames stretched farther along the dock, each lantern hanging at exactly the same height. Their light reflected across the dark water in long, trembling lines that seemed deeper than the harbor itself. I walked slowly past them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I reached the last. Lantern number 7. Unlike the others, its brass handle showed faint scratches, tiny marks, as though someone had held it through many long journeys. A folded piece of paper rested beneath it. I bent down carefully. The paper contained no words, only a simple drawing. 7 lanterns. One was shaded darker than the rest. The 7th. I looked up. Without thinking, I counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, as I spoke the final number beneath my breath. Every blue flame dimmed at once, not extinguished, only lowered. The entire pier seemed wrapped in softer light. Then, from somewhere far beyond the end of the dock, another lantern answered. Its blue glow appeared out over the water, too distant to reveal the boat carrying it. Yet it moved, slowly, deliberately, not toward the harbor, away from it. One by one, the 7 lanterns hanging beside me brightened again. The distant light faded into darkness. The moment ended. I remained standing there until the cold finally reached my hands. When I returned at first light the next morning, I expected to find a familiar row waiting for me. Instead, every lantern had disappeared. Every one except a single light hanging quietly from the last hook. Only the 7th remained. Its blue flame had vanished. Inside the glass rested an ordinary candle that had long since burned out. I reached up and lifted the lantern from its hook. It felt surprisingly light. As I turned it over my hands, I noticed something etched into the brass beneath the handle. One simple sentence. The last light is always carried by the one who stays behind. A chill passed through me. I looked across the empty harbor. No boats. No people. Only calm morning water beneath a pale sky. Then I realized the lantern I was holding had begun to feel warm. Not from a flame. From a hand that was no longer mine. Before I could let go, I heard soft footsteps crossing the wooden pier behind me. The ferry arrived on a morning when no one expected a crossing. The harbor woke beneath a blanket of pale gray clouds that softened the first light of day. A cool wind drifted in from the open sea, carrying tiny drops of moisture that settled across the wooden railings like fine glass. The streets were quiet, and the fishing boats remained tied to their posts while their owners gathered in small groups, speaking in voices too low to carry across the water. I had planned to leave the harbor that morning. For nearly 2 weeks, I had filled my journal with stories no one would believe. The empty boat, the lighthouse that never stopped turning, the cafe where strangers disappeared with the stroke of midnight. Every strange encounter had settled somewhere deep inside me, changing the way I looked at the sea. Part of me wanted to go home. Another part feared that home would no longer recognize me. I carried my small travel bag toward the bus stop near the waterfront when I noticed people gathering at the old ferry terminal. That surprised me. The terminal had been closed for years. Its windows were covered with weathered boards. The faded sign above the entrance could barely be read anymore. Yet a line of passengers waited quietly along the dock. No one seemed impatient. No one spoke. Curiosity pulled me closer. An elderly man standing beside the railing glanced toward the water. "It isn't due today," he murmured. "Does it still run?" He looked at me with tired eyes. "It stopped running a long time ago." Before I could ask another question, a low horn drifted across the harbor. It was deep, gentle, almost comforting. The passengers stepped forward together. Out beyond the breakwater, a ferry emerged from the morning mist. Its white paint had faded to the color of old bone, and narrow ribbons of rust traced the edges of its hull. The vessel moved without hurry, leaving only the faintest trail behind it. Its windows reflected the gray sky, so completely that I could not see inside. No name was painted on the bow. No flag moved above the deck. The ferry reached the dock with perfect silence. A crewman stepped ashore. His dark uniform looked neatly pressed despite the damp morning air. He lowered the boarding ramp and simply nodded. No announcement followed. The waiting passengers boarded one by one. Each carried old-fashioned luggage. Leather suitcases with worn corners. Canvas bags tied with faded rope. Wooden trunks polished by years of travel. None of them looked at one another. None looked afraid. I should have walked away. Instead, I found myself joining the line. The deck smelled faintly of polish that had absorbed generations of salt air. Beneath my shoes, the planks felt smooth from countless footsteps. Rows of long benches stretched across the passenger deck, their varnished surfaces glowing softly beneath hanging lamps. A layer of cool mist rested just above the floor. It drifted gently around the luggage without rising higher. A conductor waited beside the entrance to the cabin. He wore a navy coat with bright brass buttons that caught what little light filtered through the clouds. Without speaking, he handed each passenger a small paper ticket. When my turn came, he held one out to me. The paper felt thick, carefully made. Its edges were perfectly clean. Across the front, one date had been stamped in dark blue ink. Tomorrow. I frowned. Perhaps it was a printing mistake. I looked around. No one else seemed concerned. Several passengers calmly tucked their tickets into coat pockets before taking their seats. I turned mine over. Another stamp covered the back. This one made my hands go still. November 18th, 2076. Exactly 50 years after the day I stood aboard the ferry. I counted again. Certain I had misunderstood. The date remained unchanged. A quiet laugh escaped me. It sounded uncertain even to my own ears. There must be some mistake. The conductor looked at me for the first time. His expression held neither surprise nor apology. He spoke so softly that I almost missed the words. There are no mistakes here. Then he continued down the aisle. The ferry eased away from the dock. No engine vibrated beneath the deck. No waves struck the hull. The harbor simply began to drift farther away. I slipped the ticket into my pocket and looked through the nearest window. Outside, the shoreline seemed oddly distant already. The lighthouse stood where it always had. Yet its beams swept across the morning sky, although daylight had fully arrived. Near the abandoned pier, I thought I saw the weather-beaten fishing boat from my first day. It rested quietly against the dock, waiting. As the ferry rounded the breakwater, the mist thickened until the harbor disappeared completely. The passengers remained perfectly still. One woman gently rested her gloved hand on an old suitcase. A young sailor smiled faintly at something beyond the glass. Across the aisle, an elderly gentleman quietly polished a pocket watch that had stopped ticking. No one seemed eager to reach the other side. It was as though the journey itself mattered more than the destination. I reached into my pocket. The ticket was gone. Only a faint warmth remained where it had rested. I searched every pocket of my coat. Nothing. Then I noticed something tucked beneath the polished bench where I sat. Another ticket. I picked it up slowly. This one was older. Its edges had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in careful handwriting instead of stamped ink, were 6 simple words. Return when the harbor remembers you. I looked up at once. Every passenger was watching me, not with fear, not with anger, only quiet recognition. The ferry horn sounded again, long, low. The mist outside thinned for just a moment. Far ahead, another shoreline appeared. It looked exactly like the harbor I had left behind, except the lighthouse was gone, and every boat tied along the docks was empty. The schooner arrived beneath the warm light of an autumn afternoon. For the first time since I had reached the harbor, the sky was almost completely clear. Sunlight shimmered across the quiet sea, turning the water into countless pieces of silver. A mild breeze carried the clean scent of salt mixed with drying rope, while distant waves brushed gently against the breakwater. After everything I had seen, the ordinary beauty of the afternoon felt almost unfamiliar. It made the harbor seem honest again, as though the strange weeks behind me had been nothing more than restless dreams. I spent the morning walking along the waterfront with no destination in mind. My journal had become heavier with every passing day. Its pages held stories I had stopped trying to explain, yet I continued writing them anyway. My father always believed memories faded faster when left untold. Write them down, he would say. One day you'll need proof that they really happened. I smiled at the thought as I slipped the journal back into my coat. Then I saw the schooner. She rested alone near the oldest section of the harbor, tied to a dock where no other vessels ever stayed. Her dark wooden hull gleamed beneath fresh varnish, while polished brass fittings reflected the afternoon sun so brightly that I had to shield my eyes. She looked untouched by age. Every rope was neatly coiled, every sail folded with remarkable care. The name painted across her stern had faded beyond reading. A man stood quietly beside the gangway. He wore a Navy captain's coat buttoned neatly to the collar. His silver hair stirred gently in the breeze, and deep lines marked the corners of his face, not with hardship, but with years spent smiling beneath open skies. When he noticed me, he tipped his cap. Beautiful day for a visit. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime listening to the sea. It certainly is. You've been asking the harbor many questions. The words caught me off guard. I didn't realize anyone noticed. He smiled. The harbor notices everything. For reasons I couldn't explain, I accepted his invitation aboard. The deck felt solid beneath my feet. It smelled faintly of polished brass warmed by the afternoon sun and freshly scrubbed timber that had been lovingly maintained. Somewhere below deck, I heard the quiet ticking of a clock keeping perfect time. The captain led me without hurry. This ship has crossed many waters. I imagine it has. Some no longer exist. He spoke so casually that I almost thought I had misheard him. Inside the main cabin, sunlight poured through wide windows, filling the room with a golden glow. Shelves held carefully arranged navigation charts beside instruments whose brass surfaces shone without a trace of tarnish. Everything seemed alive, everything except the silence. On one wall hung several mirrors, framed in dark oak. The captain paused before them. "So," he asked, "what do you see?" I looked. The cabin, the table, the chairs, myself. Everything appeared exactly where it should. Everything except him. The captain stood beside me, yet the mirrors reflected only empty space. I looked again. My own reflection stared back with widening eyes. The polished cabin stretched behind me, but where the captain should have appeared, there was only sunlight falling across the floorboards. I turned toward him. He remained standing exactly where he had been. His expression never changed. "You notice?" My throat felt dry. "The mirror, it remembers differently." He said it with gentle acceptance, as though discussing the weather. I walked closer. The glass was perfectly clean. I reached out and touched its cool surface. My fingertips met only smooth reflection. No hidden angle. No trick of light. The captain still failed to appear. He chuckled softly. I spent many years trying to understand it. And now I simply let it be. We continued through the ship. He showed me the wheel, the chart room, a tiny galley where a kettle rested above an unlit stove. Everything carried signs of daily life. Nothing suggested abandonment. As we walked, he began telling stories, not dramatic adventures, small memories. A sailor teaching his son to tie knots, a woman waving from a distant pier, a crew celebrating the first sight of land after weeks at sea. Each story felt warm, human, yet every one ended too soon. There was a young cabin boy named Samuel. The captain began. He laughed louder than anyone aboard. The captain smiled at the memory. Then he stopped speaking. I waited. What happened to him? The captain looked out the window. I don't remember. Later he described a storm that lasted 3 days. When I asked how it ended, he simply shook his head. "It's gone." Again and again his stories faded before reaching their endings, as though someone had quietly removed the final pages. The realization settled heavily inside me. The harbor had been stealing more than names. Perhaps it had begun taking endings as well. Afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. Sunlight softened across the deck. "I should be going," I said. The captain nodded kindly. "I believe you should." He walked with me to the gangway. Before I stepped ashore, I looked back one final time. "Will I see you again?" He considered the question. "You may." but perhaps not where you're expecting. I smiled politely and stepped onto the dock. The wood creaked beneath my weight. A fisherman pushed a small cart past me, humming quietly to himself. I turned for only a moment to let him pass. Then I looked back toward the schooner. The dock was empty. No ropes, no polished brass, no captain, only calm water touching weathered pilings beneath the fading afternoon light. I stood there for several minutes, unable to move. The sea stretched peacefully before me. As the first evening breeze crossed the harbor, I caught sight of my reflection in the water. It was alone. The room above the dock was recommended by a woman who owned a little bakery near the harbor square. "You'll sleep well there," she said as she wrapped a warm loaf in brown paper. "It's quiet." After everything I had experienced over the past weeks, quiet sounded like the greatest gift anyone could offer. The boarding house stood above an old supply store overlooking the marina. It was built almost entirely from pine, its walls weathered by years of sea air. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows, though only a few hardy plants still bloomed this late in autumn. The owner greeted me with a gentle smile. She handed me an old brass key. "Top floor." "The attic?" She nodded. "It has the best view." I climbed the narrow staircase, listening to each step answer with a soft creak. The hallway smelled pleasantly of pine boards that had soaked up years of sunshine, mixed with a faint scent of soap from freshly washed linens drying somewhere below. The room itself was simple. A narrow bed stood beneath a sloping ceiling. A small writing desk faced a window overlooking marina. Beside it rested an old rocking chair with a knitted blanket folded across its back. The place felt lived in, comfortable, not luxurious. Exactly the sort of room I would have chosen before the harbor began changing the way I saw ordinary things. I unpacked my journal and placed it on the desk. Its pages had nearly doubled since my arrival. Sometimes I wonder whether writing everything down protected me from forgetting, or whether it only gave the harbor another place to keep its stories. Outside, evening settled slowly over the water. Fishing boats rocked gently in their slips. Lanterns flickered to life along the docks below. Families walked home carrying groceries while distant laughter drifted through the cooling air. For the first time in many days, I felt almost peaceful. I made myself a cup of tea, opened my journal, wrote only one sentence. "Today I met a man who could not appear in mirrors." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I closed the book. Sleep arrived more easily than I expected. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I heard it. One footstep, directly above my room. I opened my eyes. The ceiling remained dark. Perhaps someone was walking on the roof. The building was old. Sounds traveled strangely. A second footstep followed. Slow, measured, then a third. Silence returned. I waited. Nothing. Eventually I smiled to myself. Branches, birds, any number of ordinary explanations would do. Morning sunlight filled the room. The harbor looked perfectly ordinary below. At breakfast, I mentioned the sounds to the owner. She looked thoughtful. The roof? 3 footsteps. She stirred her tea. "There isn't any way onto the roof." "No ladder?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." I almost asked another question. Instead, I thanked her and went for a walk. The day passed quietly. By evening, I found myself almost embarrassed that I had worried over something so small. That night, I read for an hour before blowing out the bedside candle. Rain tapped lightly against the window. The familiar scent of pine drifted through the room. Sleep came again. One footstep. My eyes opened immediately. A second, crossing the roof from one side to the other. A third, stopping directly above the bed. I held my breath. No fourth step came. Only silence. It lasted so long that I finally convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Then I heard the rocking chair move. Just once. A gentle wooden sigh. I sat upright. Moonlight spilled through the window. The chair faced the desk exactly as I had left it. The blanket remained folded neatly across the back. Nothing had changed. At least, nothing I could see. The following morning, I walked around the outside of the boarding house. The roof sloped sharply in every direction. There were no stairs, no hatch, no fire escape, nothing that would allow anyone to stand above my room. I even asked a fisherman repairing nets nearby. He laughed kindly. No one's been up there in years. That evening I considered checking out. Instead, curiosity persuaded me to stay one more night. I have often wondered why curiosity is stronger than common sense. Perhaps there are simply different names for the same thing. The harbor had taught me many lessons. Leaving questions unanswered was never one of them. The third night arrived beneath a sky filled with bright stars. The marina below settled into comfortable quiet as lights disappeared one by one across the shoreline. I lay awake, waiting. Midnight passed. Nothing. Perhaps the strange pattern had finally ended. I began to relax. Then came the first step, clearer than before. A second, crossing slowly overhead. A third, stopping directly above me. This time another sound followed. Not footsteps, a faint scrape, as though someone had gently pulled a chair across wooden boards. Impossible. There was nothing above my room except the roof. I climbed out of bed. Every floorboard beneath my feet answered with a soft complaint. I stood in the center of the room, listening. The scrape came again, directly overhead. Without thinking, I looked up. The ceiling remained perfectly still. No dust drifted down. No board shifted. Yet I became certain that someone stood only a few feet above me, not walking, waiting. I reached for the brass key resting on the bedside table. Its cool weight steadied my hands. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept once across the window. The room brightened for a brief moment. As the light faded, I noticed something I was certain had not been there before. 3 damp footprints. They crossed the wooden floor from the window to the foot of my bed. No farther, no nearer, just 3. When I slowly raised my eyes again, the ceiling had fallen silent. I did not look up a second time. Instead, I remained standing beside the bed until the first light of dawn reached the window, and somewhere high above the roof, I heard a door close very gently. Copper was the first thing I noticed. Not the radio, not the room, the smell. It lingered in the air the moment I stepped through the doorway of the old weather station on the eastern side of the harbor. It was a clean, metallic scent of aged copper wiring that had warmed beneath countless summers, mixed with the faint odor of dry paper tucked inside forgotten filing cabinets. The station had been abandoned for nearly 20 years. At least, that was what the baker told me while wrapping another loaf in brown paper that morning. They left everything behind, she said. They said the new equipment made this place unnecessary. I thanked her and walked toward the shoreline. Since arriving at the harbor, I had begun following places instead of maps. The places always seemed to know where I was supposed to go. The weather station stood on a low bluff overlooking the sea. Its white paint had faded into soft shades of gray, and several windows had become cloudy with age. A narrow antenna reached into the sky above the roof, though no wires connected it to anything anymore. The front door was unlocked, like so many doors in this harbor. Inside, dust rested across the floor in an undisturbed blanket. Metal cabinets lined the walls, each labeled in careful handwriting. Wind, tides, storm records. At the center of the room stood a wooden desk. An old marine radio rested upon it. Its rounded edges belonged to another era. Large tuning dials, heavy switches. A cloth speaker faded almost white by time. Everything suggested it should have been silent forever. I walked around it slowly. The station felt peaceful. Sunlight entered through tall windows, filling the room with warm afternoon light, while the sea shimmered quietly beyond the glass. I smiled to myself. Perhaps today would finally be ordinary. Then the radio clicked. A burst of soft static drifted through the speaker. I froze. No power cord connected the radio. The electrical outlets along the wall had been removed years ago. The static settled into silence. Then a calm voice spoke. Marine forecast. The words crackled gently beneath the faint hiss of the old speaker. October 17th. I frowned. Today's date was November. The broadcast continued. Strong winds expected after midnight. Fishing vessels are advised to remain in harbor. The voice sounded steady, professional, completely unaware that decades had already passed. The message ended. Static returned. I looked around the empty station. No hidden speakers. No modern equipment, only quiet rooms and forgotten instruments. Then another forecast began. A different voice, different year. Heavy rain approaching from the north. I stepped closer. The tuning needle had not moved. One report followed another. Storms, fog, high tides, all from years long gone. I reached toward the power switch. Before my fingers touched it, the speaker clicked once more. A new forecast began. This one mentioned today's date. Exactly. My hand stopped. The voice remained calm. Clear skies through late afternoon. Outside the window, the sun still shone brightly. Winds increasing after sunset. I glanced toward the harbor. The flags remained almost motionless. The sea rested quietly beneath the afternoon light. There was no sign of changing weather. I laughed softly. The old machine had simply repeated random recordings. Nothing more. I left the station and spent the afternoon walking along the waterfront. Children played near the docks. Fishermen repaired nets. The harbor seemed wonderfully ordinary until evening. Clouds gathered with surprising speed. The bright sky disappeared beneath heavy gray layers. The breeze strengthened exactly as the radio had described. Within an hour, rain swept across the shoreline. I stood beneath the awning of a small shop, watching the storm arrive. Every detail matched the forgotten forecast, word for word. The next morning I returned to the station. The radio waited exactly where I had left it. This time I sat beside it, notebook open, pen ready. The speaker crackled again. Tomorrow morning, I began writing. High tide at 7:12. One vessel delayed. Light rain before noon. The broadcast ended. I closed my notebook. There was only one way to know. The following day unfolded exactly as predicted. The tide arrived at 7:12. A supply boat reached the harbor nearly an hour late. Rain began shortly before midday. Nothing more, nothing less. The radio never made mistakes. By the fourth day, I had stopped questioning it. Instead, I listened. Each forgotten broadcast slowly became tomorrow's weather. Storms from long ago found their way into the present. Old warnings became new again. It felt less like prediction, more like memory repeating itself. On the fifth afternoon, the speaker remained silent longer than usual. The room filled only with the quiet ticking of a wall clock that had somehow never stopped. Then the radio came alive. The familiar voice sounded quieter this time, almost hesitant. Special advisory. I leaned closer. One individual currently located. A pause. Static whispered across the speaker. Inside the eastern weather station. My pen slipped from my fingers. The voice continued. Mail! Another pause. Standing beside the main desk. Every hair along my arms rose. There could be no mistake. The broadcast was describing me. Not tomorrow. Now. I slowly looked toward the windows. Outside, the bluff remained empty. No one stood watching. The harbor below continued with its ordinary afternoon. The voice returned one final time. Listener advised. Static interrupted the sentence. For several long seconds, nothing followed. Then the last words emerged through the fading crackle. Do not answer if you hear your own voice. The speaker fell silent. The wall clock stopped ticking. A deep stillness settled over the room. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard my own voice quietly say, Can you hear me now? The museum stood at the far end of the harbor, where few visitors ever wandered. It had once been the old customs house, built from thick timber and pale stone, that had endured more than a century of storms. The building overlooked the sea with quiet dignity, its tall windows catching the soft light of an overcast afternoon. A weathered sign near the entrance read Maritime Museum, though most of the letters had faded until they were little more than shadows against the wood. I had passed it many times. For reasons I could never explain, I had never gone inside. Until that day, a cool breeze followed me through the open doorway before the heavy door eased shut behind me with a gentle thud. The building smelled of polished oak that had been cared for over generations, mixed with the faint dryness of old maps resting safely behind glass. The silence felt respectful, not empty. Display cases filled the rooms with carefully preserved pieces of the harbor's history. Ship wheels, navigation charts, glass bottles recovered from the sea, photographs of captains whose names had almost disappeared from memory. I wandered slowly, reading each small brass plaque. The stories no longer surprised me. After everything I had witnessed, forgotten sailors and vanished voyages seemed almost ordinary. Then I saw the clock. It stood alone in the final gallery, nearly 7 feet tall. Its dark oak case shone beneath a nearby window where afternoon light settled gently across the polished wood. The face was unlike any clock I had ever seen. There were no numbers, only delicate markings that rose and fell in graceful curves, like the shape of waves reaching a shoreline. The hands moved without ticking. Instead of turning in perfect circles, they drifted upward and downward with slow, flowing motions, like the tide. A small brass plaque rested beneath it. The tide clock. No date, no maker, nothing more. I stepped closer. The polished oak carried a warm scent that reminded me of my father's workshop. He used to run his hand across newly finished wood before declaring a job complete. Good timber remembers every season, he would say. Standing before the clock, I found myself doing the same. The surface felt unexpectedly warm, not from sunlight, from something deeper. The long hand lifted gently. The shorter hand followed. As they crossed one another, the glass covering the clock face became strangely clear, not reflective, transparent. An image appeared behind it. A young sailor stood on the deck of a fishing boat beneath a bright summer sky. He laughed as another crewman tossed him a length of rope. The scene lasted only a heartbeat. Then it faded. The clock continued moving. Another rise, another fall. A different face appeared. An older woman stood at the end of the harbor, waving toward a ship disappearing beyond the horizon. She smiled bravely. Even from where I stood, I could see tears shine in her eyes. The image dissolved. The hands continued their quiet journey. Every movement revealed someone new. A cabin boy carrying fresh bread. A navigator studying unfamiliar stars. A child waiting beside the lighthouse. None remained for more than a few seconds. Each vanished as the hands drifted onward. I stood there far longer than I intended. The gallery around me disappeared from my thoughts. Only the clock remained. I began to notice something else. Each person shown behind the glass looked toward me, not through me, toward me, as though they knew I was watching. A museum guide entered the room. He was an elderly man with silver hair and careful footsteps. You found our oldest exhibit. It's beautiful. He smiled faintly. It isn't always kind. What does it do? He looked at the clock instead of answering immediately. My grandfather believed it remembered everyone the sea refused to forget. I looked back toward the moving hands. Who built it? No one knows. He folded his hands behind his back. Some people say it simply arrived one morning. The guide quietly excused himself and disappeared into another gallery. I remained alone once again. The clock continued rising and falling. Its steady rhythm felt almost soothing now. Another face appeared, then another. I began counting without realizing it. 23, 24, 25. Every sailor, every fisherman, every traveler. Each one lingered only long enough to meet my eyes. The gallery grew darker as afternoon drifted toward evening. Outside, clouds gathered over the harbor. The clock never slowed. One final movement carried the hands together near the center of the glass. The next face appeared. Mine. I was standing exactly where I stood now, wearing the same coat, holding my journal beneath one arm. The image smiled gently. I did not. Slowly. The reflection inside the clock lifted its hand, not waving, pointing toward the empty space behind me. I felt every muscle in my body grow still. The room remained silent. The polished oak carried its familiar scent. The clock continued moving. I did not turn around. Not immediately. Instead, I watched my own image lower its hand. Its expression became quietly sad. Then it faded. The glass became ordinary once again. Only my real reflection remained. After a long moment, I gathered enough courage to look behind me. The gallery was empty. No footsteps. No visitors. Only rows of silent exhibits waiting beneath the fading afternoon light. I let out a slow breath and started toward the exit. As I reached the doorway, I glanced back one final time. The tide clock had stopped. Its hands rested together, perfectly still, pointing directly at the place where I had been standing. Spring arrived quietly along the harbor. The harsh winds of winter faded into gentle mornings, and the sea softened beneath longer days filled with pale sunlight. Wild grass returned between the weathered docks, while small flowers pushed through cracks in the old stone paths, as though the shoreline had remembered how to breathe again. I had been away for several months, or at least I believed I had. Time never seemed to move quite the same around the harbor. My journal insisted only a few weeks had passed since I first arrived, yet the changing seasons told another story. I stopped trying to decide which one was right. The harbor always kept its own calendar. It was early one morning when I noticed the people gathering near the eastern seawall. No one raised their voice. No one seemed alarmed. They simply stood in quiet circles, watching something below. Curiosity drew me closer. The tide had fallen just enough to expose a narrow strip of stone beside the harbor wall. There, resting against the rocks, lay an enormous anchor. Its iron surface was dark with age, worn smooth by countless years beneath the sea. Thick chains disappeared into the water before fading from sight, as though the rest of the anchor belonged to another world below the tide. But it was not the anchor that held everyone's attention. Fresh white roses surrounded it, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. They had bloomed during the night. Their bright petals stood in perfect contrast against the old iron, untouched by salt water or wind. Tiny drops of morning dew rested on every blossom, catching the first light of dawn until flowers seemed almost aglow. A gentle fragrance drifted through the cool air, sweet at first, then something else found its way beneath it, the faint scent of distant seawater. Not unpleasant, only familiar. It reminded me of opening an old sea chest that had remained closed for many years. The crowd slowly dispersed. No one picked the flowers. No one crossed the small circle surrounding the anchor. An elderly fisherman removed his cap before quietly walking away. Others did the same. Within minutes, I found myself standing there alone. I knelt beside one of the roses. Its petals felt impossibly fresh. There was no soil, no roots, only flowers blooming directly from cracks surrounding the old iron. My father loved roses, not because he grew them well. In truth, he rarely did. But every spring he planted another bush beside our home, saying that anything willing to bloom after winter deserved encouragement. I smiled at the memory. Then I noticed something tied around the anchor's chain, a narrow ribbon, weathered, faded, almost white, carefully knotted. Another rested nearby, then another. Each ribbon carried a single handwritten name, Thomas Reed. The name stirred something deep inside my memory. I had seen it before, not here, on an envelope, the paper sails, the tiny ship beyond the breakwater. I looked farther along the chain. More ribbons, Margaret Ellis, Samuel Price, names I recognized from strange moments scattered throughout my weeks in the harbor. The ledger, the bell, the forgotten stories. Every path seemed to be leading back to the same place. A soft voice spoke behind me. "You've started remembering." I turned. An elderly woman stood a few steps away. She carried a small basket filled with fresh white roses. Her face seemed familiar, not because I had met her, because she resembled someone from an old photograph. "Who are these flowers for?" I asked. She looked toward the anchor. "For those who are still expected." "They're gone." She smiled gently. Gone isn't always the same as forgotten. Without another word, she placed one rose beside the iron and quietly walked away. I watched until she disappeared around the curve of the harbor wall. The morning passed slowly. Visitors came and went. Each person left a flower. None stayed long. No one spoke above a whisper. By late afternoon, the sea had begun rising once again. Small waves reached the lowest stones. The roses remained untouched. As sunset painted the harbor in soft gold, I returned to the seawall one final time. The crowd had vanished. Only the anchor remained. The evening breeze carried the sweet fragrance of the blossoms across the quiet water. I sat nearby and opened my journal. For a long while I simply watched the tide. The sea rose patiently. One gentle wave reached the anchor. Then another. The white roses did not drift away. Instead, they slowly sank beneath the surface, exactly where they had bloomed, one by one, until only the dark iron remained. The water climbed higher. Soon the anchor itself began to disappear beneath the returning tide. Chain, shank, one broad arm. The last curve of iron slipped beneath the sea without a splash. The harbor looked ordinary once more, as though nothing had ever rested there. I closed my journal. Something inside it caught my attention. Pressed between two pages lay a single white rose. I was certain it had never been there before. Its petals were perfectly dry. Its fragrance had almost faded. Only the faint trace of seawater remained. I carefully closed the journal again and held it against my chest, far out beyond the breakwater, where the evening light met the darkening sea. I thought I saw the outline of a ship resting on the horizon. It did not move. It simply waited. Then, carried across the quiet water by a breeze too gentle to disturb the surface, I heard someone whisper my name. When I looked toward the sound, there was only the endless sea, and one white rose floating where the anchor had disappeared. The island appeared on a morning when the sea seemed almost too calm to be real. The sun had only just climbed above the horizon, washing the harbor in a soft golden light. Thin clouds drifted lazily overhead while the water reflected them with such perfect clarity that the boats looked as though they floated between two skies. The cool morning breeze carried the clean scent of salt mixed with fresh sea grass drying along the shore. I had not planned to leave the harbor that day. After the roses disappeared beneath the tide, something inside me had grown quieter. I found myself waking before dawn, walking the waterfront without knowing exactly what I hoped to find. Perhaps I was no longer searching for answers. Perhaps I had simply grown used to the harbor asking questions. I stood beside the eastern pier with a cup of warm coffee resting between my hands when I noticed it. An island, small, covered with pale green trees. It rested only a few miles beyond the breakwater. I lowered the cup. I had looked across that stretch of water every day for months. There had never been an island there before. Several fishermen noticed it as well. They stared for only a moment before quietly returning to their work. None of them prepared a boat. None spoke about it. It was as though they had learned long ago that some things were not meant to be followed. I remembered the little ferry, the captain without a reflection, the tide clock. Every strange path had led me farther into the harbor's hidden memories. I could not ignore this one. A small rowboat rested against the dock. Its owner was nowhere to be seen. A note lay folded neatly beneath one of the oars. Only 4 words had been written across the paper. Return before evening tide. Nothing else. No signature. No warning. Only those 4 quiet words. The crossing took less than 20 minutes. The sea remained perfectly calm beneath the boat, disturbed only by the gentle dip of the oars. No bird circled overhead. Even the wind seemed unwilling to follow me across the open water. As I drew closer, the island became beautifully ordinary. White shells covered the narrow beach. Tall grass moved gently across low hills. A cluster of small cottages rested beneath weathered pine trees farther inland. Smoke no longer rose from their chimneys. Yet nothing appeared abandoned. The rowboat touched the shore with barely a sound. Warm sand shifted beneath my boots as I stepped onto the beach. For a brief moment I smiled. The place felt peaceful. Then I took another step. The warmth vanished. The sand beneath my feet became so cold that I stopped walking. Not frozen, simply empty of warmth. I knelt and touched it with my hand. The surface remained dry beneath the morning sun, yet it carried the chill of deep winter. When I stood again, the next step felt warm once more. Another became cold. The island seemed to breathe beneath every footfall. I followed a narrow path leading toward the cottages. Wildflowers bloomed beside weathered fences. Laundry still hung quietly from one clothesline, gently moving in the breeze, although the fabric had faded almost white with age. The first cottage stood with its front door slightly open. I knocked softly. No answer came. Inside, everything remained exactly as though someone had stepped outside only moments earlier. A kettle rested beside the stove. 3 bowls waited on a wooden table. A child's knitted scarf hung from a chair near the fireplace. Dust covered almost nothing. Only silence had settled there. The second cottage held much the same. Freshly made beds, books resting open, a pair of spectacles beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. Every room suggested life interrupted, not ended. I remember my own home after my father passed away. For weeks I could not move his favorite chair. It seemed impossible that a place could continue without the person who had filled it. These cottages carried that same quiet feeling. They were waiting, not mourning. By midday, I had explored nearly the entire island. Every cottage held signs of ordinary lives. None held people. Near the center of the island stood a small wooden sign. The writing had nearly disappeared. Only one sentence remained readable. No boats remain after sunset. I looked toward the shoreline. My rowboat still rested where I had left it. The tide had not yet begun to rise. A peaceful afternoon stretched ahead. Even so, an uneasy feeling settled over me. I decided it was time to leave. The path back to the beach seemed simple enough. Yet after several minutes of walking, I found myself standing once again before the same weathered sign. I frowned. Perhaps I had taken the wrong trail. I chose another. It curved gently between pine trees before opening, onto the same clearing. Again, a third path, the same result. The cottages never changed. The sign remained waiting. The island had quietly folded every road back onto itself. My breathing became slower, not from panic, from careful thought. I marked one tree with a small piece of white chalk from my pocket. Then I walked in a straight line toward the shore. 10 minutes later, I passed the same marked tree. The sea was nowhere in sight. The island had no edge anymore. The afternoon light slowly softened. Long shadows stretched across the empty cottages. For the first time since arriving, I noticed something missing. There were no footprints. Not mine, not anyone else's. The sand around every doorway remained perfectly smooth, as though no one had ever entered or left. A cool breeze stirred the branches overhead. Then, somewhere beyond the cottages, I heard the distant splash of oars moving through calm water. Hope rose inside me. I hurried toward the sound. It remained just beyond the next row of trees. Always close, never closer. The light continued fading. I stopped walking. The note beneath the oar returned to my mind. Returned before evening tide. I closed my eyes for a long moment. When I opened them again, the sea lay only a few yards ahead. My rowboat rested exactly where I had left it. The shoreline looked unchanged. I climbed aboard without looking back. The crossing home felt strangely longer. As the harbor slowly came into view, I glanced over my shoulder one final time. The open water stretched quietly behind me. There was no island, only the endless sea reflecting the first stars of evening. The warehouse stood at the far western edge of the harbor, where the busiest docks gave way to forgotten buildings that no longer appeared on modern maps. Most people never walked that far. The roads became narrower. The windows grew older. Even the wind seemed quieter there. A week had passed since the island disappeared behind me. Yet I found myself thinking about it every morning. Sometimes I caught myself looking toward the horizon, expecting it to return with the sunrise. It never did. Instead, the harbor offered something new. I first noticed the warehouse because of its paint. Every building around it had surrendered to time. Their walls had faded beneath years of salt air. Their doors carried the marks of countless winters, and their roofs sagged beneath old storms. Only one building looked freshly cared for. Its wide wooden doors had been painted a clean gray. The brass handle shone. Someone had swept the steps that very morning. Yet no footprints crossed the dust beyond them. The smell reached me before I entered. Fresh paint, sharp but pleasant. The scent was so new that it seemed impossible. Inside a building no one appeared to visit. I rested my hand against one of the doors. The wood felt smooth, almost warm. It opened without resistance. Inside, sunlight slipped through high windows, filling the warehouse with long beams of pale light. Wooden crates stood stacked neatly along the walls, each covered by clean canvas sheets. Thick ropes hung from heavy ceiling beams, perfectly coiled despite their age. Everything looked ready for work. No workers remained. The silence settled gently around me. Not lonely, simply waiting. Then I saw it. An old lifeboat rested in the center of the room. It was larger than I expected, painted white with a narrow stripe of faded navy running along its side. Every board had been freshly restored. The wood gleamed beneath a careful coat of varnish, and the oars rested neatly inside as though someone expected to launch it before the day ended. It looked too alive for such an empty place. I walked around it slowly. The smell of fresh paint lingered around the hull, mixed with clean timber that reminded me of my father's workshop. He always believed that repairing a boat meant respecting the people it once carried. A vessel remembers every hand that trusted it, he used to say. Standing beside the lifeboat, I found myself wondering whose memories still rested inside these polished boards. The ropes suspending it from the ceiling moved gently. I stopped walking. There was no breeze. The windows remained closed, yet the thick ropes swayed together in slow, graceful arcs, back and forth. Only once. Then they became perfectly still again. I looked upward. The heavy beams above showed no sign of movement. Perhaps I had imagined it. After everything the harbor had shown me, I had learned not to trust first impressions. I reached out and rested my fingertips against the lifeboat's side. The paint felt dry, smooth, almost new. Someone had cared for it recently. I looked around for tools, brushes, buckets, anything, nothing, only empty shelves and quiet sunlight. Before leaving, I glanced back one final time. The boat remained exactly where I found it, or so I believed. The next afternoon I returned. The warehouse greeted me with the same fresh scent of paint, the same peaceful silence, the same careful order. But something was different. It took several moments before I understood. The lifeboat had moved. Not much, perhaps 2 feet. Yesterday it had rested beneath the center beam. Now it stood slightly closer to the open doors. I smiled uneasily. Perhaps I had remembered its position incorrectly. The mind enjoys playing quiet tricks when left alone too long. I chose not to think about it further. Instead, I circled the room carefully. Dust covered the wooden floor. No footprints. No wheel marks. Nothing suggested the heavy boat had been moved by anyone. Only its new position insisted otherwise. That night I slept poorly. The warehouse stayed with me, not because I feared it, because I couldn't explain it. The following morning, I arrived before sunrise. Mist rested lightly over the harbor, and the first rays of daylight slipped through the warehouse windows in long golden lines. The lifeboat had moved again. It now rested only a few yards from the entrance, closer than ever. The ropes above hung perfectly straight. No marks crossed the dusty floor. I felt a quiet chill settle across my shoulders. The exit stood open behind me. The boat faced it, not by design, by intention. I don't know why that thought came to me, only that it did. I walked toward the stern and noticed something I had missed before. A small brass plaque had been fastened near the tiller. Its letters were worn almost smooth. I brushed away a thin layer of dust. One sentence remained. For those who arrive after the rescue. I read it twice, then a third time. The words carried a sadness I cannot explain. Behind me, one of the ropes creaked softly. I turned at once. Nothing had changed, yet the boat seemed somehow nearer, only by inches. I convinced myself it was another trick of perspective. Still, I stepped backward. Then another step. The warehouse felt much larger than before. The distance between me and the door seemed strangely longer. I reached the entrance and paused. Morning sunlight filled the doorway. Outside, I could hear fishermen beginning another ordinary day. Laughter drifted faintly across the docks. Life continued. I looked back once more. The lifeboat rested quietly in the center of the room, exactly where it should have been. I almost laughed at myself. Perhaps exhaustion had become its own kind of ghost. I closed the warehouse doors and walked away. When dawn returned the next morning, something drew me back one last time. The brass handle felt cool beneath my hand. The doors opened with the same quiet ease. Inside, the warehouse was empty. No lifeboat, no ropes hanging from the ceiling. Only a broad rectangle of clean would remain on the floor where the boat had once rested. Sunlight poured through windows, touching the empty space as though nothing had ever occupied it. I stood there for a long while. Then I noticed something drifting across the harbor outside, far beyond the breakwater. A single white lifeboat. No oars moved. No one sat inside. It slipped silently toward the open sea until the morning light became too bright for me to follow it any farther. Midnight had become my favorite time to walk the harbor. Most people preferred the safety of daylight, but the hours after midnight felt strangely honest. The shops were closed, the fishing boats rested quietly against their moorings, and the sea no longer had to compete with the noise of ordinary life. Whatever secrets the harbor wished to keep always seemed closer after the town had fallen asleep. That night, the moon hung low above the water. Its pale light stretched across the harbor in a silver path that reached almost to my feet. A gentle breeze drifted in from the open sea, carrying the cool scent of salt mixed with damp canvas from the old fishing sails drying along the docks. The air felt peaceful, almost welcoming. I had only reached the end of the eastern pier when I heard it. Someone was singing. The voice was soft, clear, too distant to belong to anyone standing nearby. I stopped walking. The melody floated across the quiet water with a slow, gentle rhythm. It reminded me of the songs my mother used to hum while washing dishes late in the evening. She never sang loudly. She always believed quiet songs lasted longer in a person's memory. For a moment, I smiled, then I realized something. There were no boats on the water. No figures stood along the shore. The harbor was empty, yet the singing continued. I followed the sound toward the old lighthouse. The melody never became louder. It remained the same distance away, no matter how far I walked. The notes rose and fell like gentle waves, each one lingering just long enough to disappear into the next. It was beautiful, and somehow deeply lonely. I reached the lighthouse steps and looked across the water. Nothing, only moonlight dancing upon the sea. The song drifted behind me. I turned. It came from the opposite direction now. Not quickly, not unnaturally, simply somewhere else, as though the harbor itself had begun singing. I closed my eyes. Perhaps that would help me hear more clearly. Instead, I noticed another voice. Then another. The lonely melody slowly became a choir. Not loud, not overwhelming, just many gentle voices woven together into one peaceful hymn. Some sounded young. Others carried the quiet weight of old age. None of them felt unfamiliar. I listened carefully. The melody shifted. Without warning, I recognized one of the voices. My grandmother. She used to sing while knitting beside the window every winter afternoon. I had forgotten the tune years ago. Yet there it was. Perfect. Untouched by time. My chest tightened. Another voice joined beside hers. My father, not speaking. Singing. I had heard him sing only once. On the day he believed no one else was listening. The memory returned so clearly that I could almost smell the cedar shavings from his workshop scattered across the floor. I opened my eyes. The harbor remained empty. The voices continued. Each familiar note carried another forgotten piece of my life. Birthdays, family dinners, long afternoons repairing old boats, rain tapping gently against our roof while my mother laughed at something I could no longer remember. The choir seemed to know every memory I had misplaced. Tears blurred the moonlight, not from fear, from gratitude. Somehow, the harbor had protected even the smallest parts of the people I loved. The melody changed again. This time the familiar voices slowly faded, one by one, until only strangers remained. Their song felt older, sadder. It carried the quiet patience of those who had waited a very long time. The breeze freshened. The scent of damp canvas drifted past once more. Far across the water, I noticed tiny points of light appearing near the horizon. Not boats, lanterns. They floated in a long curved line, rising and falling gently with the tide. Each light seemed to move in perfect time with the music. I counted them. There were too many. The song grew quieter. The lanterns dimmed. Then I heard another voice. Very close. Close enough that I instinctively looked beside me. No one stood there. The voice belonged to me, not the voice I use today. A younger one, perhaps 12 years old. It sang the same melody without hesitation. I listened in stunned silence. I did not remember ever learning those words, yet my younger voice knew every line. It continued alone after the choir had faded. Clear, gentle, certain. The last note lingered across the water before disappearing into the night. Everything became still. The moonlight remained. The lanterns had vanished. Even the breeze seemed to rest. I stood there for several minutes, waiting for the song to return. It never did. At last I turned toward home. Halfway down the pier, I caught myself quietly humming the melody. Without thinking, without trying, I stopped immediately. The tune ended, or at least I believed it had. Then, from somewhere behind me over the open water, the same melody continued exactly where I had fallen silent. Only this time, it was being sung by a single voice that sounded exactly like mine. The compass found me before I ever went looking for it. It was another cold morning along the harbor. Winter had quietly returned, wrapping the shoreline in pale light and sharp air that made every breath feel clean. Thin frost rested on the wooden railings, while the fishing boat sat motionless beneath a sky the color of worn silver. I had stopped expecting ordinary days. The harbor had taught me that every quiet morning carried the possibility of becoming something else. I wandered through the old market near the western docks, where only a handful of antique shops remained open through the colder months. Most displayed weathered maps, brass telescopes, faded photographs, and forgotten pieces of sailors' lives. One small window caught my attention. Resting alone on a velvet cloth was an antique compass. Its brass case shone softly beneath the morning light, not brightly, not freshly polished, simply cared for. I stepped inside. The shop smelled of old cedar shelves mixed with the dry scent of paper that had rested untouched for decades. A tiny bell above the door announced my arrival, but no one appeared behind the counter. The compass sat exactly where I had seen it. Its glass was perfectly clear. The needle moved gently. I smiled, then my smile faded. The needle wasn't pointing north. It pointed toward the harbor. I lifted it carefully. The brass felt strangely warm despite the freezing morning outside. Almost comforting. An elderly shopkeeper emerged from a back room, moving slowly with the help of a polished walking stick. You've chosen the only item that chooses people first. I looked up. How much is it? He smiled. It doesn't belong to me. Before I could ask another question, he quietly turned away to arrange books on a nearby shelf. I waited. He never mentioned the compass again. When I looked back down, a small handwritten note rested beneath it. Return it when you arrive. I frowned. Arrive where? The shopkeeper simply smiled without answering. A few moments later, I found myself walking back toward the harbor with the compass resting safely inside my coat pocket. I had no memory of paying for it. The first thing I noticed was its certainty. No matter which direction I turned, the needle refused to face north. It always pointed toward the same place, beyond the oldest docks, beyond the warehouses, toward a forgotten section of the harbor I had never explored. Curiosity led me onward. The streets gradually narrowed. Modern buildings gave way to weathered stone paths lined with abandoned storehouses whose windows had long ago surrendered to dust. The farther I walked, the quieter everything became. Even the cries of distant seabirds disappeared. The compass remained warm in my hand. Its needle never wavered. It guided me between rows of empty buildings until I reached a dock I had somehow never noticed before. Small fishing boats rested there beneath faded tarps. None appeared seaworthy. None carried names. I looked around. The place felt forgotten. Yet nothing seemed neglected. It was as though the harbor remembered this place, even if everyone else had not. The compass shifted. Its needle turned farther to the right. I followed. A narrow walkway curved between two warehouses before opening into another small pier. Something immediately felt wrong. The bakery that should have stood across the water was gone. The lighthouse appeared farther away than it should have been. Even the church bell tower had vanished from the skyline. I turned quickly. The street behind me no longer looked familiar. Another glance at the compass. The needle urged me onward. Each step erased something else. The old cafe where I had once spent a midnight, surrounded by silent strangers. Gone. The boarding house with the attic room above the marina. Gone. The museum that held the tide clock, gone. Only empty docks remained. A quiet unease settled inside me. The harbor itself seemed to be forgetting. Or perhaps it was helping me forget. I reached into my pocket and found my journal. Relief washed over me. At least I still had proof. I opened it. The pages were blank. Every story, every memory, every careful note, gone. Only the pressed white rose remained between two empty pages. Its petals had become almost transparent. I closed the journal slowly. For the first time since arriving at the harbor, I wondered whether I had imagined everything. Perhaps there had never been an empty boat. Perhaps the lighthouse had always been ordinary. Perhaps I had simply been alone too long. The compass grew warmer. Its needle turned one final time. Now it pointed beyond the end of the dock, straight into the open sea. Nothing waited there. Only gray water stretching toward the distant horizon. The warmth spread through my hand until it almost felt alive. Then it stopped. The needle became perfectly still, no longer moving, no longer searching, as though it had reached its destination. I looked down at the calm water below. For a brief moment, another reflection appeared beside mine. It was my father, not as I remembered him during his final years. Younger, smiling, he looked toward the horizon instead of at me. Without speaking, he slowly raised one hand, not waving goodbye, pointing toward the sea. The reflection faded with the smallest ripple. I stood alone once more. The compass slipped quietly from my fingers. It struck the wooden dock without making a sound. When I bent to pick it up, the brass case had disappeared. Only the needle remained, resting on the weathered planks, still pointing toward the open water. The old Coast Guard station stood farther from the harbor than any place I had visited before. It rested alone on a narrow stretch of coastline where the cliffs met the sea. The building overlooked the water with quiet determination, as though it still expected rescue boats to return at any moment. Its white walls had faded beneath years of storms, and several windows were covered by weathered shutters that gently tapped together whenever the breeze found them. The station had been abandoned for decades. Everyone in town agreed on that, yet no one seemed willing to walk near it after sunset. I arrived just before evening. The sky was covered with low gray clouds, and the sea rolled quietly against the rocks below the cliffs. The air carried the familiar scent of damp uniforms and old canvas that had absorbed countless years of salt spray. The front gate hung slightly open. It welcomed me without a sound. Inside the station, everything remained almost exactly as it had been left. Wooden desks stood neatly arranged beneath dusty windows. Maps still covered the walls. Shelves held neatly folded life jackets whose bright colors had softened with age. A large rescue board listed emergency call signs from another generation. No one had erased them. My footsteps echoed gently through the empty hall. I stopped beside the communications room. A heavy radio console rested against one wall, surrounded by faded notebooks and carefully labeled switches. Every light on the panel was dark. Every cable had long since been disconnected. The room should have been completely silent. Then a speaker clicked. A burst of soft static drifted through the air. I felt my heart slow, not from fear, from recognition. The harbor had spoken through old machines before. The radio crackled again. A calm voice emerged. "Mayday!" The transmission faded beneath static. Taking on water, another pause. 3 miles east. Silence returned. I waited. The message sounded old. Very old. The sort of distress call that had ended decades before. The speaker came alive again. A different voice. A woman this time. "We've reached them." Her words broke apart beneath the crackling signal. "Everyone safe?" The transmission ended. I frowned. The rescue had already happened. Why was the station receiving it now? I opened one of the faded logbooks lying beside the radio. The handwriting was careful and precise. Every page recorded emergency calls, dates, locations, weather conditions. I searched until I found the same coordinates I had just heard. Beside the entry someone had written, "All survivors recovered." 42 years earlier. The radio clicked again. Another distress call. Another voice asking for help. Each one matched a completed report inside the logbook. Every caller had already been rescued. Every emergency belonged to the past. Yet the station continued listening, as though time had never moved forward. Outside, daylight slowly faded. Rain began tapping gently against the windows. The smell of damp uniforms grew stronger, filling the quiet room with memories that did not belong to me. I imagined tired rescue crews returning after long nights at sea, boots dripping across these wooden floors, cold hands wrapped around cups of coffee, small smiles exchanged after bringing strangers safely home. The building still remembered them. Perhaps that was why it refused to fall completely silent. I closed the logbook. The radio remained quiet for several minutes. Then every speaker in the room awakened together. Static filled the station. Not loud, just enough to cover the sound of rain. A single voice slowly emerged. Young, calm, almost familiar. Coast Guard Station 9. A pause followed. If anyone is listening, my fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. I've been trying to find the harbor. The words settled heavily inside me. I knew that voice, not because I had heard it before, because it belonged to me, not the man I had become, the younger version of myself, perhaps 20 years younger. The voice continued. I don't know where I am. Another pause. I can see the lighthouse. Static briefly interrupted the transmission. Then the final sentence arrived with perfect clarity. I think. The signal weakened. I think I'm almost home. Silence followed. Complete silence. Even the rain seemed to stop. I stood motionless beside the radio. The room felt strangely smaller now. Not confined. Simply closer. As though every wall had leaned in to listen. A small telephone resting on the corner of the desk began to ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. Its sound echoed softly through the empty station. I stared at it. The ringing continued. Steady. Patient. I remembered the warning from the weather station. Do not answer if you hear your own voice. My hand hovered above the receiver. I could almost convince myself it was only an old telephone with no power. The ringing stopped. Relief washed through me. Then the receiver slowly lifted from its cradle by itself. It hung suspended for only a moment. From the speaker came one quiet breath. Then a voice, older now, my own voice, soft, certain. It spoke only 2 words. My turn. The receiver settled gently back into place. Outside, the rain began again. I walked out of the Coast Guard station without looking behind me. The path down the cliff seemed longer than before, but I never hurried. When I reached the harbor, night had fully arrived. The lighthouse cast its beam across the dark water one final time before disappearing behind the drifting clouds. As I stood alone at the edge of the pier, I noticed something waiting beside the first mooring post. A neatly folded Coast Guard jacket. Its fabric was damp with sea spray. Embroidered above the pocket, in faded white thread, was a single name. Mine. Night refused to end. I noticed it first when I woke to the steady ticking of the small clock beside my bed. The hands insisted it was nearly 6 in the morning. Yet darkness rested outside the window as deeply as it had at midnight. The marina below lay silent beneath a sky filled with unmoving stars. Their pale light reflected across the harbor without the slightest hint of dawn. I dressed slowly. For weeks, perhaps months, the harbor had carried me through mysteries that no longer felt impossible. Empty boats had returned without crews. Old radios had spoken with forgotten voices. Clocks had remembered sailors long after the world had forgotten their names. Yet this felt different. The world itself had stopped moving. When I stepped outside, the air carried the faint smell of cooled ashes from fireplaces that should have burned out hours before. It was not unpleasant. It reminded me of mornings after winter storms, when my father would rake the stove clean before making fresh coffee. He always believed every new day deserved a clean beginning. I wondered what he would have thought of a day that never began at all. The streets were almost empty. A few lamps still glowed outside quiet homes. Fishing boats rested against the docks, their ropes hanging without movement. Even the sea seemed to breathe more slowly, its surface smooth beneath the frozen stars. I looked east. The horizon held no trace of light, only darkness. I walked toward the harbor out of habit more than purpose. The familiar places welcomed me in silence. The old cafe where strangers had once gathered after midnight stood closed now. The museum windows reflected nothing but the endless night. Beyond them, the lighthouse turned with patient rhythm, its beams sweeping across the water exactly as it always had. Only now it illuminated a morning that never arrived. I checked my watch. An hour had passed. The sky remained unchanged. Near the end of the pier, I found an elderly fisherman sitting on an overturned crate. He held an empty mug between his hands. "You've noticed," he said quietly, "the sunrise." He nodded. "It hasn't missed a day in my whole life." Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally I asked, "Does it worry you?" He smiled gently. It did. And now I grew tired of worrying. He stood, tipped his cap, and walked slowly back toward town. His footsteps faded into the quiet. I remained alone beside the water. As the hours slipped by, people slowly stopped searching the horizon. Shopkeepers opened their doors beneath the stars. Children played quietly in the streets as though this strange night had become ordinary. The harbor adapted. Only I continued looking east. My journal rested beneath my arm. When I opened it, the pages seemed different somehow. Not blank, not full, peaceful. The stories no longer felt unfinished. They felt connected. The empty boat, the paper sails, the blue lanterns, the captain without a reflection. Every strange encounter had carried me a little farther from the life I thought I understood. Perhaps they had never been warnings. Perhaps they had always been invitations. The thoughts settled inside me with surprising comfort. For the first time since arriving, I stopped asking when I would leave. Instead, I sat at the edge of the pier and listened. The harbor had always spoken, through bells beneath the tide, through forgotten radios, through voices rising from still water. Now it spoke through silence. A long while passed before I heard anything else. At first, it was only the gentle splash of water against old pilings. Then another sound, soft, measured, footsteps. They crossed the dock behind me, without hurry. I did not turn around. Somehow, I knew I did not need to. The footsteps stopped beside me. A quiet presence settled there, looking out over the same endless night. No fear touched me, only curiosity. Then a voice, calm as the sea itself, spoke beside me. "Thank you for waiting." The words were almost carried away by the breeze. I closed my eyes. The smell of cooled ashes drifted through the air once more. When I opened them again, I was alone. The stars remained exactly where they had been. The lighthouse continued its endless sweep. Still no dawn came. For the first time since my journey had begun, I stopped searching for the morning and simply listened to the sea. The shoreline glowed as though the moon had decided to walk upon the earth. It was another night without morning. The harbor had stopped waiting for sunrise, and so had I. Shops opened beneath starlight. Fishermen mended their nets by lantern instead of daylight. Children laughed beneath a sky that never changed, as though they had forgotten the sun had ever existed. Only I still remembered its warmth. Some nights, I wonder if that memory belonged to me at all. I walked along the quiet beach east of the harbor, where smooth sand met gentle waves. The sea breathed softly against the shore, leaving thin silver lines that disappeared almost as soon as they appeared. The air carried the clean scent of salt mixed with cool sea grass swaying beyond the dunes. Everything felt suspended, not frozen, simply waiting. That was when I saw him, far ahead, where the water touched the sand. Someone was walking. His outline shimmered with a pale silver glow that blended so naturally with the moonlight. I almost mistook him for another reflection upon the sea. He wore the clothes of an old sailor, a long coat, simple boots, a weathered cap resting low across his brow. Each step carried quiet certainty. Yet when I looked behind him, there were no footprints. The sand remained perfectly smooth. I slowed without meaning to. He continued walking, never looking back. The distance between us stayed exactly the same, close enough to see, too far to reach. The moonlight flowed gently across his shoulders, making him seem less like a person and more like something the sea itself had remembered. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Only the quiet wash of waves accompanied our steps. Then, without turning, he asked, "Do you enjoy walking at night?" His voice was calm, warm, like someone continuing a conversation that had begun years earlier. I suppose I do. So do I. Silence settled comfortably between us. There was nothing strange about it. No pressure, no fear. Only two travelers following the same shoreline. After a while he spoke again. People think every journey ends when land appears. And it doesn't? He smiled faintly. Some journeys only begin there. The words lingered with me. I thought about the empty boat, the lighthouse, the tide clock. Every mystery had led me somewhere unexpected. Perhaps the sailor understood those paths better than I ever could. We continued walking. The sea reflected his silver light until the waves themselves appeared to glow. I noticed something unusual. The breeze lifted the edge of his coat. The water moved. The tall grass swayed. Yet nothing disturbed the sand beneath his feet. Still no footprints. I looked down at my own. A clear trail stretched behind me, marking every step I had taken along the beach. His path remained invisible, almost forgotten before it happened. "You've walked here before," I said quietly. He nodded. "Many times." "I don't remember seeing you." "You weren't ready to." His answer carried no mystery, only simple truth. We reached an old wooden bench overlooking the harbor. He stopped there. For the first time, he turned toward me. Moonlight rested gently across his face. He looked neither young nor old. His eyes held the quiet kindness of someone who has spent a lifetime watching ships disappear beyond the horizon without bitterness. Something inside me stirred. Recognition, not certainty. Only the feeling that I should know him. "I think we've met." His smile grew softer. "I believe you remember pieces." I searched my memory. My grandfather, the harbor master, the captain without a reflection. None of them matched. Yet something about his eyes felt deeply familiar. "You knew my father." The words escaped before I could stop them. The sailor nodded. "We sailed together." I stared at him. "My father never worked at sea." "He did." The answer came so gently that I almost accepted it without question. Then another memory surfaced. My father standing beside our workshop, staring toward the harbor every evening before coming inside. Sometimes he remained there for several quiet minutes, as though listening for someone. I had never asked why. "He spoke of you often," the sailor continued. "What did he say?" "That you always search for the whole story." A quiet laugh escaped me. "He's right. He usually was." Neither of us spoke for a long while. The harbor rested peacefully beneath its endless night. Then the sailor looked toward the water. I should continue. "Will I see you again?" He stood. "When you stop trying to remember." "You will." He stepped toward the shoreline. The silver light around him grew brighter with every pace. Not blinding, only softer, like moonlight becoming mist. Within moments, he began fading into the glow surrounding him, before he disappeared completely. He looked back one final time. He smiled, not in farewell, in recognition. Then he was gone. Only the gentle sea remained. I walked slowly to the place where he had been standing. The sand was untouched. No footprints. No sign that anyone had ever walked there. Only one small object rested near the water's edge. A weathered brass button. It matched the buttons once sewn onto my father's old navy coat. I picked it up carefully. It felt warm in my hand. Far out beyond the harbor, a single silver figure continued walking across the quiet water until moonlight finally carried him beyond my sight. The harbor forgot me before I noticed anything was missing. It began with small things. A shopkeeper who looked at me twice before nodding as if confirming something uncertain. A fisherman who greeted me by the wrong name and didn't seem embarrassed when I corrected him. A child on the pier who stared at me for too long, then quietly asked her mother, "Who is that man?" I told myself it was nothing. The night without dawn had stretched on long enough that memory itself felt unreliable. Still, something inside me tightened with each passing hour. The streets of the harbor looked the same. Weathered stone paths, fishing nets drying along wooden rails, lanterns glowing softly beneath an unmoving sky. But the feeling of belonging was thinning, like fog pulled gently apart by an unseen tide. I stopped at the small cafe near the central dock. The same place where I had once sat among silent strangers at midnight, drinking tea that never seemed to cool properly. Now it was filled with morning activity that felt almost ordinary. People spoke quietly at tables. A bell above the door chimed as I entered. The owner looked up, paused, then smiled politely. "Can I help you?" The question didn't feel rude. It felt rehearsed. "I usually come here in the mornings," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "I'm sorry. I don't think I've seen you before." Something cold moved through me. I tried to laugh. "I've been staying in the harbor for months." A brief pause. Then she offered a soft, careful smile. "That's nice." She turned away. Just like that, the conversation ended. No recognition. No correction. Only polite distance. I sat at a table near the window anyway. Outside, the harbor moved as it always had. Boats rocked gently. Seabirds circled in slow arcs. Life continued without hesitation. Yet none of it seemed to acknowledge me. I opened my journal. The pages were still filled with writing. My handwriting. But something was wrong. Entire paragraphs felt unfamiliar. Descriptions of places I clearly remembered visiting now read as though they belonged to someone else. As I turned another page, I noticed a blank space where a chapter should have been. Not torn, not erased, just missing, like it had never been written at all. A faint smell of old cedar drifted through the cafe. I froze. That scent had always meant something specific. My father's workshop. Sawdust, warm wood, quiet evenings when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I looked up sharply. Across the cafe, a man sat alone near the corner table. He was old. His coat hung neatly over the chair beside him. He was not looking at me, but I felt it anyway. Recognition without acknowledgement. I stood slowly. The man finally turned his head. Our eyes met. For a moment, I thought I saw understanding in his expression. Then it faded, not into confusion, into absence, as though something had gently removed my shape from his memory while I was still standing there. He looked away, returned to his tea, as if I had never moved. I stepped outside. The air felt colder than before. The harbor remained bright under its endless night, but something in it had shifted. I walked toward the eastern pier without thinking. Each step felt slightly lighter, not physically, more like my presence was becoming less anchored to the ground. Names drifted through my mind. My own name felt distant, like a word I once knew well but could no longer say without effort. At the edge of the pier, I stopped. The water below reflected the sky perfectly. No ripples, no change, just stillness. I looked down. My reflection was there. At first. Then it blinked. I did not. My reflection smiled. I did not. A quiet panic rose inside me, but it didn't fully form into fear. Even that felt like it was slipping away. Behind me, footsteps approached. I didn't turn, not because I was afraid, because I wasn't sure I needed to anymore. A voice spoke gently. "You're fading faster now." The words felt accurate, not cruel, just observant. I finally turned. There was no one there. Only the harbor, only the night, only the water reflecting a sky that never changed. I opened my journal again. This time, the ink on the pages began to blur. Not running, not smudging, simply losing definition, as if the meaning behind the words no longer agreed to stay. I closed it quickly, held it tight, but even the weight felt uncertain now, like it might decide to leave my hands. If I loosened my grip, a memory surfaced. My father standing at the edge of a dock, turning toward me, saying something I couldn't quite hear anymore. His voice was warm, certain, fading. I tried to hold on to it, but it slipped away before I could catch the words. The harbor lights flickered gently across the water, somewhere far beyond the breakwater. I thought I saw a figure standing still, watching, but when I blinked, there was only the sea. And for the first time, I wasn't sure the harbor had forgotten me, or if I was the one finally learning to let it go. The final dock did not appear the way the others had. It did not reveal itself through disappearance or memory loss. It simply extended. That morning, when I walked toward the eastern edge of the harbor, the shoreline no longer ended where it used to. Weathered wooden planks stretched farther than any map or memory could justify, continuing past the breakwater and into open water, as if the sea itself had agreed to make room. The sky above remained unchanged. Endless night. No stars moved. No wind disturbed the surface of the water. Even the usual sounds of the harbor felt distant, as though they belonged to another version of the world. I stepped onto the dock without hesitation. My reflection in the water followed me a moment later, slightly delayed, like it was unsure whether it still needed to copy me. The wood beneath my boots felt familiar, not because I had walked here before, because it felt like it had been waiting. Each plank was smooth, worn down not by time but by repetition, as though countless footsteps had passed over it long before mine arrived. I walked slowly. The dock stretched on, farther than it should have, farther than anything should be allowed to stretch without support or end. The harbor behind me grew quieter with every step, not silent, just less present, like a story being gently closed while I was still reading it. Ahead, the water reflected a sky without stars. No horizon could be found, only continuation. I stopped halfway out, though it creaked softly beneath me. For the first time, I realized something strange. The sound was not coming from the dock. It was coming from memory. From every dock I had ever stood on, every wooden pier I had ever crossed, all of them echoing at once beneath my feet. A voice I recognized but could not place spoke softly from behind me. "You always walk too far." I turned. No one was there, but I felt the presence anyway. Not threatening, not unfamiliar, simply complete. I continued forward. The dock narrowed slightly as it extended, as if guiding me towards something it already understood. The sea on both sides remained perfectly still, not calm, waiting. Then, faintly, I began to hear voices, not from ahead, not from behind, from everywhere at once. Familiar voices. The cafe owner, the fisherman from the empty mornings, the lighthouse keeper I had never fully met, the sailor made of moonlight, my father, all of them speaking at once, not in words I could fully understand, but in tones that carried recognition instead of fear. The dock answered them with a soft creak beneath my steps, as if it were agreeing. I reached the end, or what should have been the end, but there was no drop into water, no stopping point, only continuation, as though the dock had folded reality into itself until direction no longer mattered. Ahead of me, the water reflected something impossible. Not the sky, not the sea, but every place I had been. The lighthouse, the island cottages, the tide clock, the empty boat returning alone, all layered gently across the surface, like memories learning how to breathe. The voices grew quieter, not fading, settling, as if they were finally resting. I stepped forward again, and the dock did not end. Instead, it widened slightly, welcoming. Behind me, I heard footsteps approach once more. This time I did turn. A man stood there, not clearly defined, not fully separate from the light around him. Still, I recognized him without needing to see his face fully. My father, or what remained of the idea of him the harbor had carried all this time. "You found it," he said. I swallowed. Found what? The place where everything you follow was leading. I looked around, at the endless dock, at the still water, at the harbor that no longer felt like a harbor. "This doesn't feel like an ending," I said quietly. He nodded. "It isn't." A pause, then softer. "It's the part where you stop being the one who arrives." The words should have frightened me. They didn't. Instead, they felt like something I had known for a long time, but refused to understand. I looked down at my hands. They were still there, but not entirely anchored, like light remembering the shape of a person. Behind my father, the dock continued into a glow I could not name. Not bright, not dark, just complete. He stepped aside, not inviting, not forcing, simply making space. All the voices I had ever heard in the harbor returned in a single quiet moment, not speaking, waiting. I understood then that none of them had ever been calling me away. They had been guiding me back into something I had always been part of. The dock beneath my feet felt steady, more real than anything before it. I took one final step forward, And the harbor behind me did not vanish. It simply became quiet enough to no longer need me. For the first time since I arrived, I was not leaving anything behind. I was only arriving where everything had been waiting. Dawn arrived without breaking the night. It didn't rise or unfold the way it should have. Instead, the darkness simply softened, like ink thinning in water, until horizon stopped feeling like a boundary at all. The sea below the final dock reflected something between morning and memory, a light that had no clear source, yet filled everything with quiet warmth. I stood at the edge where the dock widened into that impossible stillness. No wind moved across the water. No gulls circled. Even time itself felt like it had stepped back to watch. The voices were gone now. Not silenced, not taken, just resolved. Like a story that finally understands its last line. Behind me, the harbor no longer felt distant. It felt included. As if everything I had ever seen there was part of the same quiet breath I was now standing inside. My father remained beside me, not fully formed, not fully fading either. Just present in a way that didn't ask to be explained. He looked out across the water. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "It always arrives like this. What does—" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his hand slightly, pointing toward the open reflection ahead. The water was no longer just water. It held every place I had ever walked in the harbor. The empty boat returning alone. The lighthouse where figures appeared in rotating light. The cafe that never closed. The bell beneath the tide. The island that existed only in calm mornings. The sleeping lifeboat. The singing harbor. The compass pointing home. All of it layered gently together. Not as separate events anymore, but as one continuous place. One journey, he said finally, and I was never leaving it. I said quietly. He shook his head. No, you were learning it. The words settled inside me without resistance. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was remembering stories. I felt like I was standing inside them. The dock beneath my feet was no longer weathered wood. It was continuity. A path made from every moment I had followed without understanding why. I took a slow breath. The scent that came with it was not salt alone anymore. There was cedar from my father's workshop, dried roses from the anchor, old paper from the harbor ledger, warm candle wax from the lighthouse, all of it together, like the harbor had finally stopped separating its memories. My father turned slightly toward me. "You don't have to keep walking," he said. I looked at the water, at the reflection of everything I had known. "I think I already stopped walking," I said. He smiled faintly. "Yes." A long silence followed. Not empty, complete. Then I asked the only question that still remained. Was any of it real? He glanced toward the water again, and for a moment I thought he might say no. Instead, he answered gently. "It was all real enough to bring you here." That was not an explanation, but it felt like one. The reflection on the water shifted slightly, not changing, just acknowledging, as if the harbor itself was listening. I stepped closer to the edge of the final dock. There was no fear now, only recognition. The place I had followed had never been pulling me away from anything. It had been assembling me, piece by piece, from everything I had forgotten how to hold at once. My journal was in my hand. I opened it one last time. The pages were no longer blank or rewritten. They were full, but not with words, with impressions, light, sound, warmth, names I no longer needed to read to understand. I closed it again, slowly. My father's voice softened beside me. "When you're ready," he said, "you'll see what comes next." I looked at him. "For you too?" He nodded once, then began to fade, not like disappearance, but like distance becoming unnecessary, not leaving, just no longer separate. The dock ahead remained, endless, calm, complete. The harbor behind me no longer felt like somewhere I had come from. It felt like something I had been part of all along. I took one final step forward, and there was no transition, no moment of loss or arrival, only the quiet understanding that everything I had followed had already been home. Somewhere far behind, where the idea of the harbor once existed as a place, a single lantern flickered once more, then rested, and the sea continued to listen,